The listing had been vague. Remote fixer-upper, historic, exceptional price. To Elias Vance, a man determined to escape the city's noise and the crushing weight of his late wife's absence. Vague sounded like blessing. Stillwater Manor sat 3 miles down a neglected, mud-churned private road, shrouded by an ancient grove of moss-draped cypress. The moment Elias stepped out of his truck, the silence was immediate and absolute, broken only by the persistent, soft drip, drip, drip of water. Though the sky was clear, the house was enormous, a crumbling Victorian structure built of dark, heavy stone. Inside, the air was thick, humid, and tasted faintly of iron. Every surface, even the ceilings, seemed perpetually damp. The wallpaper, a hideous, faded floral pattern, was peeling in great, sodden strips, revealing the damp plaster beneath. Elias walked into the foyer. A grand, curving staircase dominated the space, but the wood of the banister felt strangely yielding, almost spongy. He reached out to steady himself, and his fingers came away slick. "Just old pipes," he muttered, trying to sound convinced. He found the dining room first. An oval shadow marred the center of the oak floor, as if a long table had recently been removed. But it wasn't the shadow that caught his attention. It was the reflection in the wet wall. He walked past a large mirror leaning against the wall, but when he glanced back at the damp, peeling plaster, he saw a fleeting image, a woman, standing where he had been moments before, her face obscured by a veil of long, dark, wet hair, her silhouette impossibly elongated. She wasn't reflected in the mirror. She was reflected on the wall itself, as if the moisture held a temporary memory. He spun around. Nothing. Just the dripping silence. Sleepless night on the road, he rationalized, running a hand over his tired face. Yet, when he turned back, the spot on the wall was subtly different. The pattern of the moisture had coalesced into a single tear-shaped droplet, hanging heavy before sliding down and leaving a temporary ghostly trail. Elias chose the smallest, driest-looking bedroom on the second floor as his base. He spent the first day unpacking tools and battling the damp. That evening, as dusk bled into the cypress trees, Elias sat in the mildewed parlor, nursing a mug of instant coffee. He noticed an antique music box perched on the mantelpiece, its carved wooden lid intricately decorated with figures that seemed to be dancing in profound sorrow. He opened it. The tiny mechanism was rusted, and the comb was broken in several places. It was clearly non-functional. He closed the lid. 10 minutes later, he heard it. A sound so delicate, it felt more like an impression than a noise. A tiny, chiming melody, high and clear, rising from the parlor. It was a haunting, simple tune, repeating the same 4 sorrowful notes. Elias put his coffee down, his skin prickling. He knew that tune. It was the lullaby his wife, Sarah, used to hum for their daughter, before. He crept back to the parlor. The sound was coming from the mantel. He looked at the music box. The lid was closed. He slowly reached out and flipped the lid open. Silence. The rusted gears were still motionless. He closed the lid. Nothing. He stood there for 5 minutes, heart pounding, listening to the oppressive stillness of the house. He was about to write it off as auditory hallucination when the melody began again, soft, tiny, and terribly close. Elias snatched the music box up, tilting it towards the light. The sound wasn't coming from the box. It was coming from the wood itself. The dense, aged timber of the casing seemed to be resonating, humming with an internal, ethereal vibration that mimicked the melody. He dropped the box onto the velvet-covered armchair. The chime stopped instantly. Later, huddled under his sleeping bag upstairs, he heard the tune again, not from the parlor, but directly beneath his floorboards. It was slower now, stretched out, as if the house was struggling to remember the notes. The 4 notes played over and over. Loss, regret, stay, gone. Elias began his work on the foundation, battling the creeping moss and the saturated earth. He soon discovered the source of the persistent dampness. Stillwater Creek, which had once flowed 50 yards away, had been subtly rerouted over the centuries, and a strong subterranean spring now ran directly beneath the house's limestone cellar. The house wasn't damp, it was immersed. He went down to the cellar. It wasn't a room, it was a cavern. The ground was slick mud, and the air was freezing. In the center of the space stood a single massive well. Its stone curb was heavily worn, coated in a thick, dark slime. As Elias shone his flashlight into the well, the beam hit the water, not stagnant, but flowing rapidly beneath him, dark and endless. He could hear the heavy gurgle of the water rushing away into the depths. He leaned in, trying to see the bottom. As he did, a wave of unbearable, crushing grief washed over him. It wasn't his grief for Sarah. This was colder, older, more profound. It was the memory of a tragedy he hadn't lived, a sorrow that felt institutional. He saw the water flicker, and for a terrifying second, the surface wasn't water at all, but a polished mirror reflecting the ceiling. And on that reflection, he saw not the bare stone vault, but a thick, braided rope, taut and fraying, tied to a sturdy beam. He stumbled back, gasping for breath. The image vanished. The water was dark and opaque again. The four-note melody, louder now, began playing right beside the well. Elias backed away until his shoulders hit the damp stone wall. The stone suddenly felt soft, yielding. A section of the wall beside him seemed to depress under his weight. He shone his light. A shallow, hand-sized cavity had opened in the plaster, and in it rested a tiny child's slipper, made of faded blue silk soaked through with the same dark water. He didn't touch it. He knew instinctively that this was not merely an object. It was a clod of memory. He fled the cellar, running up the curving, spongy staircase. As he reached the top, he looked down, and in the space where the slipper had been, he saw a fresh pool of water forming. The water flowed, not towards the well, but up the stairs. A tiny, determined current, tracing the path of the house's older sorrow. Elias spent the night, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The damp, dark ceiling now seemed to have a faint, phosphorescent glow. The melody had followed him upstairs, sounding now like it was being played on broken glass. He knew he couldn't stay, but a terrible intellectual curiosity held him. He was a prisoner of the unknown grief. He went back to the cellar, taking a powerful battery lantern. He needed to understand the well. As he descended, the air grew instantly heavier. The well was silent now, the water still. He noticed something carved deeply into the stone curb, right at the rim. She sank, and the house remembers. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his chest. She, the child, the slipper. He looked around the cellar, illuminating the furthest, darkest corner. There, half submerged in the mud, was a small, crudely fashioned wooden chair. A high chair. It was broken, the wood splintered, and the safety strap was torn. As he knelt beside it, the chair seemed to shift, settling deeper into the mud. He looked back at the wall where the slipper had been found. The shallow cavity was now wider and deeper, and in it, arranged neatly, were other objects.
A faded photograph of a stern-looking man, a tarnished silver locket, and a small brittle book, its cover slick and black with cellar slime. Elias reached out for the book. As his fingers closed around the cover, he heard a sound right behind him. A sighing, wet sound, like linen being unfolded underwater. He snatched the book and turned, expecting to see the elongated woman from the reflection. He saw nothing, only the dark well and the ancient, porous stone. He opened the book under the lantern's harsh light. The pages were mostly illegible, but the final, surviving inscription was written in clear, heavy script, using what smelled unmistakably like blood and iron. I could not save my daughter, nor could I forgive the house for drawing her in. I have written this, and sealed the sorrow in the walls, the wood, and the water. The house is now the archivist of grief. All who live here must now carry its memories until they add their own. Elias looked at the well. It was no longer a place of water. It was an eye staring up at him, dark and filled with the collective, unshakable sorrow of all who had lived and lost in Stillwater Manor. The damp walls were closing in, the air thick with the memory of the lullaby. Elias closed his eyes and felt a sudden heavy pressure on his chest, as if the grief of the house, vast and cold, was settling upon him. When he opened his eyes again, the walls around him were glistening, and in their reflections, he saw not only the vague outline of the woman with the wet hair, but a new, distinct silhouette forming next to her. The silhouette of a tired, broken man, staring down into an empty, ancient well. The four notes of the melody began to play, emanating now not from the wood, but from the depths of his own beating heart. Ethelberg was a town dedicated to precision. Every street was geometrically perfect, every garden hedge trimmed to within a millimeter of its neighbors, and every inhabitant lived by the insistent, unwavering chime of the great town clock, which stood sentinel over the central square. It wasn't just a clock. It was the town's mechanical heart, a Gothic cathedral of brass, steel, and crystal that governed every breath and every schedule. Silas Vance was a clockmaker by trade, a restless, brilliant eccentric who arrived in Ethelberg on a humid Tuesday. He came because of the silence. 2 weeks prior, the great town clock of Ethelberg, the clock that had never gained, never lost, and never stopped for 150 years, had suffered a catastrophic failure. It hadn't merely stopped, it had locked up violently. The mainspring had unwound with a sound like a single agonizing scream, shattering the crystal face and raining brass debris onto the cobblestones below. Since that moment, Ethelberg had existed in a strange limbo. The people were quiet, unnaturally so. They still went about their routines, working, eating, sleeping, but without the governing beat of the clock. Their movements were hesitant, their eyes vacant. They looked perpetually surprised, as if waiting for a cue that never arrived. Silas, hired by the silent, austere town council, was granted access to the clock tower. The interior of the clock tower was vast, a cathedral of industry. Light filtered down through the remaining shards of the crystal face, illuminating motes of dust, dancing around the gigantic, immobile mechanism. Silas spent 3 days just surveying the damage. The mainspring was a write-off. The escape wheel was shattered, and the grand pendulum, a smooth cylinder of polished platinum, was frozen mid-swing. He traced the workings. Following the intricate chain of power, he realized the clock was impossibly complex. It wasn't just a timekeeper. It controlled things he couldn't explain. He found tiny, delicate wires running from the primary gear train, leading out through the stone walls toward every building in the town, like fine, metallic nerves. On the 4th day, he discovered the heart chamber, located deep beneath the main mechanism, accessible only by a set of slippery, iron spiral stairs. The chamber was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was a perfectly spherical vault, and in its center hung the clock's true engine, a glowing orb of complex interlocking gears, constantly moving, generating immense, silent power. This was not a power source. It was a perpetual motion machine of exquisite, unnerving design. But the orb was also dead. It was dark, cold, and still. As Silas examined it, he noticed a minute carving etched into the brass frame surrounding the orb. The ticking is the trust. He frowned, then began the complex work of disassembling the main drive. As his wrench touched the first giant gear, a sound, faint and chilling, echoed in the vault. A single soft sob. Silas froze, wrench poised. Hello? Silence. Only the whir of his own blood. He continued his work. When he removed the first gear, a piece of flawless, heavy steel, he heard the sob again, closer this time, accompanied by a sound like a desperate intake of breath. He looked around the empty vault. He realized the sound was coming from the orb itself. The orb, though silent, was somehow resisting the disassembly. Silas worked for a week, replacing shattered parts, fashioning new ones from the custom materials the council provided. The council, a group of 5 identically dressed, middle-aged men with eyes that never blinked, never offered encouragement, only vague, disturbing warnings. "Be sure, Mr. Vance," the head counselor said, his voice flat as slate. "The clock does not tolerate imperfection. Its time is our time. Its beat is our soul." The parts of the clock he was replacing were heavy, solid, and utterly conventional. But when he finally reached the inner layers of the main mechanism, he found things that defied physics. He found gears made not of metal, but of petrified wood that pulsed faintly under his lamp. He found bearings crafted from perfectly clear, yet warm, crystal spheres that smelled faintly of ozone. and then he found the regret wheel. It was a small, filigreed wheel, intricately cut, located just above where the main pendulum attached. It was the only part of the mechanism that was still turning, but it was moving backward, slowly and unevenly. As he watched it spin in reverse, Silas was overwhelmed by a sudden, potent wave of memory. Not his own, but the memory of a young woman standing on a bridge, looking down at dark water, filled with an unbearable sense of lost opportunities and bitter self-reproach. The vision was so vivid, it made him stumble. He realized the regret wheel was not regulating time. It was accumulating and reversing a vast emotional debt. He looked closer at the metal. The teeth of the wheel were worn smooth in several places. Stuck between two teeth was a single, brittle, blonde human hair. Suddenly, the whole chamber grew icy cold. He heard a whisper, clear and sharp, right next to his ear. "Don't mend the broken hours." Silas scrambled away from the mechanism, heart hammering. He shone his light everywhere. Nothing. Only the immense, silent, mechanical labyrinth. He knew then that the clock was alive, and it wasn't powered by physics. It was powered by the lives of Ethelberg. Silas eventually managed to repair the primary damage. The new mainspring was installed, the new escape wheel was perfect, and the platinum pendulum was ready to swing. The final piece was the heart chamber orb. The orb was the lifeblood. The orb had to be reactivated. He descended the iron steps for the last time. The air was heavy, charged. He brought with him a specialized magnetic current generator, the only thing he thought might restart the massive, ancient engine. As he approached the spherical mechanism, he saw that the orb was no longer dark. A faint, greenish light was pulsing within the complex gears. And then he saw what was powering it. Woven into the smallest, most intricate interlocking pinions of the orb were masses of tiny, dried, organic fibers, like minute, colorless veins running through the metal. At the core of the orb, where the perpetual motion was meant to begin, was not a gear, but a small, pulsating, wet organ that looked chillingly like a preserved human heart, kept beating by the motion of the gears around it. It was the source of the life, and the source of the grief. Silas understood the function of the clock. It did not measure time, it extracted it. The precision of Ethelberg's citizens was their offering. Their monotonous, perfect routines were the grinding stones that kept the mechanical heart beating, draining their emotional range and their free will in exchange for perfect temporal stability. The clock kept Ethelberg from the chaos of time, but it required a constant, surgical harvest of the human soul to do so. He looked back at the etching. The ticking is the trust. The citizens trusted the clock to govern their lives, and in doing so, they gave it their humanity. Silas raised the magnetic generator, ready to start the orb. If he did this, the clock would begin ticking, and Ethelberg would return to its perfect, inhuman routine. The people would regain their direction, but they would lose the faint, desperate glimmer of sentience that the silence had allowed them. He hesitated. He looked down at the tiny, beating organ in the gears. As if sensing his doubt, the heart chamber filled with a cacophony of soft, desperate sounds. The distant echo of laughter, the cry of a baby, the sharp, agonized whisper of the regret wheel. And then, a sound that cut through the noise, the four sorrowful notes of the music bot's melody from the house on Stillwater Creek, a sound that was not part of the clock's memory, but Elias Vance's own, a sudden, powerful surge of human regret and memory. He realized that the clock was not just drawing energy, it was drawing souls, and once the pendulum started, Elias would be consumed, too, becoming the final, essential fiber in the mechanism. With a snarl, Silas slammed the heavy generator against the stone floor. Sparks showered as the delicate equipment shattered. He didn't look back at the orb. He turned and fled up the spiral staircase, climbing toward the broken face of the clock. He emerged into the center square as the sun dipped behind the western ridge. The people of Ethelberg were gathered, waiting. They stood frozen in the fading light, their faces pale, watching the silent, broken mechanism. They looked like statues awaiting a command. Silas grabbed a heavy bronze fragment of the clock's shattered crystal face. He held it up, catching the last ray of light. "It will not start again," he shouted, his voice cracking the unnatural silence. "The time is yours now. Live it." The people did not move. Their eyes remained fixed on the broken tower. Silas dropped the shard and turned, running toward his truck,
speeding away from the town of perfect streets and silent people. As he reached the ridge and looked back, he saw something new. High in the clock tower, where the broken crystal face had been, a single flickering red light began to pulse, slowly, unevenly. And in Ethelberg, below, the silent, expectant figures turned, not toward the light, but toward each other, their faces still vacant, but now with a chilling uniformity, as if they had all just received a new, unspoken command. The clock had stopped ticking, but the heart was still beating, and now the people were the gears. The island of Alien did not appear on any modern chart. It was a shifting anomaly, a low-lying expanse of black sand and basalt columns that seemed to float just outside the navigable waters of the North Atlantic. For centuries, sailors whispered of Alien's curse. Anyone who set foot upon it would instantly lose all sense of direction, unable to discern north from south or the rising tide from the receding one. Alara Vane, a cartographer whose professional obsession was the eradication of unknown territories, arrived on Alien's volatile shore in a custom-built hydrofoil. She was armed with advanced gyroscopes, multiple redundant GPS systems, and an unwavering belief in quantifiable reality. The moment her boots touched the black sand, her instruments went mad. The needle of her magnetic compass spun into a frenzied blur. Her GPS screen flashed a dozen contradictory coordinates, none of which were alien. The world tilted. She felt it immediately, the crushing, profound sense of being lost. It wasn't just geographical, it was existential. She could no longer tell if she was facing the sea or the island's interior. Alien was dominated by one feature, a gigantic, petrified forest of coal-black columns that rose hundreds of feet, forming a vast, bewildering maze. Between the columns, the ground was covered by a fine, metallic dust that swallowed all sound. Alara knew her first priority was to establish a fixed point. She walked for what felt like hours, trying to reach a prominent, spire-like column she had noted from the sea. She never reached it. Every time she thought she was nearing the spire, she would round a column and find herself staring at the open, featureless sea. She was moving, yet the distance to the spire never lessened, and the distance to the sea remained constant, always just one turn away. Defeated by the impossible geometry, Alara began charting the ground beneath her feet, creating a micro-map of her immediate surroundings. She found that the columns themselves were not rock, but a dense, cold material that hummed faintly under her touch. And then she stumbled upon the house. It stood nestled within a small, circular clearing of white coral sand, an impossibly delicate, two-story structure made entirely of weathered driftwood, shell casings, and pieces of nautical salvage. It was beautiful, impossible, and felt intensely out of place in the desolate landscape. A handwritten sign, fixed to the door with a rusted fishhook, read, "The cartographer awaits. Please wipe your feet of north." Alara stepped inside. The air was warm, dry, and smelled of brine and old parchment. The floorboards were packed smooth with dried sea salt. In the center of the main room, illuminated by the dusty light filtering through thin, oiled paper windows, sat an elderly man. He was impossibly thin, dressed in layers of heavy, patched wool. His eyes were wide, milky, and seemed to hold the depth of the ocean. He sat hunched over a massive, cylindrical desk, covered in maps. "You're late," the old man rasped, his voice like sand shifting over glass. "The tide changes in 7 hours. The chart must be complete by then." Alara stared. "Who are you? What is this place?" "I am the cartographer," he replied, dipping a wickedly sharp silver pen into an inkwell of iridescent dark liquid. "And this is the shore of finality, the place where all lost things wash up, including directions, intentions, and souls." He gestured to the maps covering his desk. They were stunningly intricate, not of land or sea, but of processes. One showed the flow of human regret, another, the contour lines of forgotten knowledge, a third, the currents of time itself. The cartographer introduced himself as Jonas and explained his work with terrifying detachment. "Alien is the focal point," he said, without looking up. "Everything that is not flows here. My duty is to chart the moments, the mistakes, the missed turns that cause a life, a ship, or an idea to become lost. I map the vectors of failure. He slid a parchment toward Ilara. It was her own micromap of the shore, the one she had drawn an hour ago.
But Jonas had continued it. Her tiny lines of struggle extended, not onto the land, but spiraling inwards, becoming darker and more compressed until they ended at a single,
precise spot labeled, the final hesitation. You lost your direction the moment you hesitated to follow your father into the lighthouse business, Jonas stated, his milky eyes briefly locking onto hers. That hesitation was a choice you abandoned. It washed up here, and now it guides your path. Ilara felt sick. Her father, the lighthouse, the memory was painful, true, and deeply private. My compasses failed, she choked out. My technology. Instruments of order are useless where chaos is the rule, Jonas said simply. Alien measures you, not the Earth. It is a mirror of disorientation. If your inner direction is fractured, the island will reflect that fracture perfectly. He then revealed his most terrifying chart, a map of the island's maze-like columns. He dipped his pen and on a spot near the center, drew a perfectly detailed, fresh sketch of the driftwood house. The house itself is part of the map, he whispered. It drifts with the mental tides. When my work is done, the house washes away. And I become the material for the next house. He pointed to the raw, splintered wood of the walls. Look closely, cartographer. Do you see the faces in the grain? Ilara approached the nearest wall, forcing herself to look past the shadows. The grain of the driftwood was not random. It was intricate, patterned, and yes, it coalesced into features, eyes, mouths, and elongated, silent expressions of profound regret. The house was built from the remains of previous cartographers. Jonas's time was running out. His movements became jerky, his voice fainter. He was racing to finish the last map, a massive rendering of the tides of memory. The tide is turning, Jonas warned, his body trembling violently. Soon, the land will reorient. The currents of aliens' lostness will pull you to your own inevitable point. Your destination is the final hesitation. Ilara looked down at the map of herself. The point Jonas had labeled, the final hesitation, was inside a tight, closed loop of her spiraling tracks. It was the point where she would simply stop, unable to move in any direction, waiting to be consumed by the sand. She realized Jonas didn't want to finish the map. He wanted her to take his place. His final act was to chart his own demise and pass the torch. She grabbed the silver pen from the desk. The moment her fingers closed around the cold metal, a surge of overwhelming, agonizing clarity struck her. She saw the true arrangement of the columns, the actual path to the sea, and the terrible, logical symmetry of Alien. She understood the island's horrifying secret. Alien was not chaotic, it was perfectly ordered, but its order was based on the internal, emotional geometry of the person traversing it. You map only the loss, Ilara accused, her voice firm. You chart the failure, but never the return. Jonas looked up, his milky eyes widening in pure horror. There is no return, only the acceptance of error. The shore only collects what is abandoned. Ilara ignored him. She dipped the silver pen into the dark ink. She didn't trace the map of memories. She grabbed the map of regret, and using the sudden, perfect clarity gifted by the pen, she began drawing. She drew a massive, sweeping curve that did not follow the existing lines of remorse. Instead, it cut sharply across them, intersecting 3 different currents of sorrow and linking them to a single, powerful new vector. She labeled it the acceptance of imperfection. As the ink dried, the driftwood house began to shake violently. The walls groaned and splinters flew. Jonas screamed, a thin, dry sound that cracked like snapping bone. You cannot chart a path that does not exist. You are ruining the order. The order is failure, Ilara countered, looking him in his dying eyes. I mapped the path back to the hesitation, not through it. She completed her final line. The entire house shuddered, and the wood began to twist and dissolve, the faces in the grain screaming as their structure was undone. Ilara ran out, the silver pen clutched tightly, just as the house collapsed into a pile of unrecognizable, ordinary driftwood. She looked out at the sea. Her senses were screaming the truth. The water was high tide, the wind was from the south, and the spire she had failed to reach was directly west. Her compasses remained broken, but she didn't need them.
She now carried Alien's true map, the map of personal correction, in her mind.
She ran toward the sea, leaving the collapsed pile of wood and the vanishing metallic sand. She didn't look back to see if Jonas had become a piece of lumber. She simply ran, following the vector of acceptance. As she sailed away, she looked back one last time. Alien was already dissolving into the fog, but on the shifting shore, she saw a single, dark figure standing over the ruined wood. The figure was sketching furiously in the sand with a silver pen, starting a map of a place that was now lost to him, the shore of finality. The town of Chronamos was renowned for two things: its absolute sterile silence, and the great windowless building at its center, the Museum of Hours Lost. This was not a museum of history, but of time itself. It was said to house every moment that had been forgotten, wasted, or irreparably broken. The townspeople, pale and uniformly dressed in gray, moved with the deliberate, careful gait of those trying not to disrupt an invisible, precious balance. Dr. Alistair Finch, a historian of anomalous events, had spent 5 years lobbying for access. He was finally granted permission, but only under the supervision of the museum's sole inhabitant, the curator. The curator, a woman named Vera, was an unnerving figure. Her skin was the color of aged ivory, and her heavy, gray dress seemed to absorb all light. When she spoke, her voice was low and musical, yet strangely flat, as if she were reading sheet music for a song she couldn't hear. "You must understand, Dr. Finch," Vera said, leading him through the massive bronze doors. "Time is not merely chronological here. It is physical, it is fragile, and it is stored." The interior was immense, a labyrinth of interconnected circular vaults. Each vault housed a different kind of lost time. The first vault was the most disturbing. The air here was thin and smelled metallic. Along the walls were thousands of slender glass vials, each containing a tiny, shimmering thread of light that seemed to pulse and dim. "These are spilled seconds," Vera explained, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Moments of near misses, decisions you almost made, words caught on the tongue. They leak from the world." As Alistair approached one vial, he was overcome by a sudden, potent sensation. The memory of being in a car, slamming on the brakes inches from an intersection, followed by the crystalline sound of glass shattering. It was a memory of an accident that had never actually happened. He stumbled back, unnerved. What happens if these are opened? Vera gave a faint, chilling smile. If you reintroduce a spilled second into the present, the moment it represents must resolve. The near miss becomes the hit. The unspoken word is spoken. The consequences are often retroactive. She led him past a wall of shelves dedicated to misplaced leisure. Entire holidays, ignored sunsets, and forgotten naps. All condensed into dark, heavy crystals that hummed with a low resonance. Alistair noticed that some shelves were empty, swept clean of their contents. "Where did these go?" he asked. "The time was used," Vera replied simply. "A desperate man, perhaps, needed 3 weeks of unspent rest to avoid death. He paid a steep price, of course. Time is never free." They moved to the central chamber, the heart of the museum. This vault contained the most precious and volatile collection. Unmade futures. The room was filled with massive antique grandfather clocks, but they were all shattered. Their brass workings were twisted and fused, their faces cracked and showing random, chaotic numbers. Vera pointed to a particular clock, its wood casing blackened and warped. "This clock holds the entire future of the city of Versailles. Had the French Revolution failed," she murmured, "an immense weight of potential, brutally snapped by a single guillotine blade." She explained that when a major, world-altering decision is made, or avoided, the alternative future does not simply vanish. It is violently excised and stored in the museum. Alistair walked past the clocks, feeling the immense, silent pressure of billions of lives that never were. The air grew hot, thick with the phantom friction of conflicting realities. He stopped before a small, silver-plated clock. It was pristine, yet completely silent. "What about this one?" he asked. Vera's usual flatness cracked, and a deep, sorrowful fatigue entered her voice. That is the life you would have led, Dr. Finch, had you married the woman you loved instead of dedicating your life to lost causes.
Alistair felt a sharp, agonizing stab in his chest.
A beautiful, clear vision of a simple cottage by the sea, a warm hand in his, and the scent of baking bread flooded his mind. It was a life of contented obscurity, a life he had abandoned years ago for the sterile pursuit of the anomalous. The clock began to hum, emitting a very faint, lonely tick. "It is still trying to assert itself," Vera whispered, placing a hand on the silver casing. "But the museum has claimed it." He looked at Vera's face, now etched with a profound personal sadness. "Why do you stay here, Vera? Why collect this pain?" "Because," she replied, her eyes distant, "if no one holds the broken pieces, time would cease to flow. The weight of all those unmade futures would retroactively crush the present. I am the anchor. I am the collector of counterfactuals." Alistair spent 3 weeks in the museum, meticulously documenting the artifacts. He learned that the museum wasn't just storing time. It was actively consuming the present of Chronomos to power its stasis. That was why the townspeople were so lifeless. Their vitality was the payment for temporal stability. On the last night, Vera took him to the lowest sublevel, the crypt of finality. This chamber was lined not with shelves, but with alcoves, each holding a coffin-sized glass box. Inside the boxes were masses of compressed, black, crystalline matter. "These are the end times," Vera said, her voice trembling slightly. "The failed conclusions. Moments when existence itself almost stopped." Alistair recognized the oppressive weight emanating from the boxes. It was pure, distilled inevitability. He looked at Vera. Her eyes were duller, her hands were trembling, and her movements were becoming slow, mechanical. "You are fading, aren't you?" he realized. "The museum is taking your time to keep the balance. It demands a keeper," she conceded. "My hours are almost depleted. When the clock strikes 0 on my personal timeline, my physical being will be rendered into a new, complex artifact, perhaps a shield against a future extinction event." She pointed to the largest, oldest alcove, currently empty. "My predecessor is there now," she said. "He is the massive, brass mainspring that drives the entire Chronomos town clock, a mechanism of pure, spent human life." Alistair understood. The museum didn't just store the lost. It demanded a sacrifice to continue its function. Vera stepped back, her shadow seeming to detach from her and flow across the floor. "Your access pass expires at dawn, Dr. Finch. You must leave before the transfer begins." Alistair knew he couldn't leave her. He couldn't leave this terrible, necessary repository of cosmic failure. He made his decision. He went back to the gallery of unmade futures and located the small, silver-plated clock, the life he had rejected, the life of quiet, domestic fulfillment. He grabbed a heavy bronze gear from a neighboring clock, the shattered future of Versailles, and smashed the silver clock's glass casing. The moment the glass broke, the small, lonely tick inside ceased. The clock's minute hand spun violently and locked at a moment in time, 4:37 p.m., 20 years ago. A blinding, warm light erupted from the clock, flooding the chamber with the phantom scent of sea salt and freshly cut wood. Vera staggered back, shielding her eyes. "What have you done? You've destroyed the counterfactual." "No," Alistair said, feeling the weight of the lost life lift from his chest. "I haven't destroyed it. I've accepted that it never was. I've resolved the spilled second." The powerful release of energy, the life force of the unmade future, didn't shatter the museum. It didn't destroy time. Instead, it flowed straight into Vera. Her pale skin gained a faint, natural warmth. Her posture straightened. The profound sadness in her eyes was replaced by a look of stunned, almost terrified vitality. "You gave me back time," she breathed, touching her face. "No," Alistair said, feeling a curious lightness take hold of him. "I gave you back your choice, and in doing so, I made mine final." He walked deliberately toward the empty alcove in the crypt of finality, the one reserved for the next curator. He felt the cold air rush around him, pulling the warmth from his body. He turned back to Vera, who now looked fully human, yet frozen in shock. "The time of my contentment is gone," he said calmly. "But the time of my utility is just beginning. The museum needs a curator with no regrets, only purpose, I accept the final cataloging. Alistair stepped into the cold glass box. The light left his eyes, his skin faded to ivory, and his breathing became slow, metronomic. He was no longer Dr. Alistair Finch. He was the next collector of failures, the anchor of Chronomos. Vera, the former curator, was gone. Vera, the now human woman, stood alone in the museum, alive, free, and terrified, staring at the perfectly still form of the new keeper in the glass box, who began with an unnerving musical flatness to sing the forgotten lyrics of a song that no longer existed.
The town of Oakhaven wasn't on many maps, and those that did feature it marked it with a small, ominous skull icon. It was known simply as the Town of Echoing Fogs. For as long as anyone could remember, Oakhaven was perpetually shrouded in a dense, silent mist that never lifted. It clung to the ancient oak trees, seeped into the cracked window panes of the clapboard houses, and muffled every sound until the world became a soft, gray dream. Dr. Eris Thorne, a meteorologist specializing in atmospheric anomalies, arrived in Oakhaven with a truckload of sensors and a healthy dose of skepticism. He believed every phenomenon had a scientific explanation. The echoing part of the fog, however, troubled him. Villagers spoke of hearing whispers, faint music, or even snatches of conversations from their past, carried on the mist itself. The moment he drove into Oakhaven, the fog swallowed his headlights. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The air was cold, damp, and tasted faintly of old books and something metallic, like stale blood. He parked his truck and stepped out. The silence was immediate and profound. He shouted, "Hello!" and his voice was immediately devoured by the mist. There was no echo. He walked toward what he assumed was the town square, guided by the dim glow of what looked like an old gas lamp. As he approached, the lamp's light seemed to dim and brighten in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He passed a small wooden signpost, its paint peeling. He squinted through the mist. The sign read, "Oakhaven, founded 1783. Population, you are not alone." A shiver traced down his spine. He wasn't afraid of ghosts, but the implication of something else sharing the fog was unsettling. He noticed that the fog itself wasn't uniform. It swirled in specific, intricate patterns, like smoke from an incense burner, coiling around the oak trees as if it were alive. Eris found the general store, its windows dark. He peered inside, but the fog had seeped indoors, making everything hazy. He could just make out shelves of ancient, dust-covered goods, tinned peaches from the 1950s, brittle newspapers, and archaic tools. He heard it then, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from inside the store. It was too indistinct to make out words, but it sounded like a hushed, urgent conversation between several people. He pushed the door open. It creaked slowly, revealing a deeper, more unsettling silence within. The fog was thicker here, swirling around the aisles like unseen shoppers. He moved cautiously, calling out again, "Is anyone here?" The whispering stopped. He reached the back of the store and found a small, cluttered counter. On it lay an open ledger, its pages yellowed. He picked it up. It was a record of sales from 1967. The last entry was for 1 pound sugar, 1 loaf bread, 1 pint milk, and then a handwritten note scrawled in faded ink at the bottom. The fog remembers. It never forgets a word. As he read the note, the whispering started again, closer this time, right behind his ear. He spun around, shining his flashlight. Nothing. Only the swirling, empty mist. But the whisper was clear now. It was the general store owner, arguing with his wife about the price of eggs, a conversation from over 50 years ago, played out in perfect fidelity, emanating from the very air around him. Eris stumbled out of the store, slamming the door shut. The echoes ceased. He realized the fog wasn't carrying sounds. It was holding them. It was a repository of every sound ever made in Oakhaven, playing them back at random. Eris spent the next few days setting up his instruments. His atmospheric sensors registered baffling data. The fog had no discernible wind currents, no temperature gradient, and no conventional moisture content. It was a consistent, unmoving mass, yet it had the illusion of swirling. He was measuring not water vapor, but something far stranger. He eventually found the town's oldest inhabitant, an ancient woman named Alara, who lived in a small cottage where the fog seemed slightly less dense. She sat by a perpetually burning peat fire,
her face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, her eyes cloudy with age.
"You're the scientist," she rasped without looking at him. "Come to measure the words, have you?"
Eris explained his instruments. Alara merely chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "The fog is alive, boy," she said, tapping her gnarled finger on her wooden staff. "It hears everything, it remembers everything, and it wants to speak." She told him the story of Oakhaven. Centuries ago, the land was barren, unable to hold moisture. The first settlers, desperate for water, performed an ancient ritual, whispering their deepest desires into a sacred spring hidden deep in the woods. They begged for moisture, for fertility, for life. The spring answered. Ilara recounted, her voice taking on a hypnotic rhythm. It poured forth the mist, but the mist wasn't just water. It was the memory of their prayers, made manifest. And every word spoken since, every thought articulated, every sound has been absorbed by it. "Why?" Eris asked, bewildered. "Because the fog is lonely," Alara said, finally looking at him. Her eyes, though cloudy, held a profound, ancient sorrow. "It is a vast, sentient ocean of echoes, and it grows by collecting. It collects our voices, our laughter, our sorrows. It is trying to piece together the human experience, one sound at a time. And the echoes? The specific sounds people hear? They are the fog playing back a memory it finds interesting," Alara said, her gaze drifting toward the swirling mist outside her window. "Sometimes it's a warning, sometimes it's a comfort, and sometimes it's a question it's trying to answer." She pointed her staff at a particular patch of swirling mist near her window. Eris watched as the fog coalesced into a perfect, ephemeral image of a child's face, smiling, before dissipating. "That was my grandson," Alara said, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "He asked the fog if his mother still loved him, before he wandered too far into its depths." Eris was no longer a skeptical scientist. He was a horrified witness. The fog wasn't an anomaly. It was a vast, cosmic entity, a sentient recorder of all human utterance. He decided to find the sacred spring. Alara gave him cryptic directions. "Follow the path of the oldest silence. When the echoes cease, you will be close." He packed his most sensitive audio recorders and ventured deep into the ancient oak forest. The fog grew thicker, swallowing his flashlight beam. The echoes were incessant now, fragments of laughter, children's rhymes, hushed arguments, and the mournful sound of a cello playing a forgotten tune. He walked for hours, pushing through the spectral chorus. His instruments were useless. They were overwhelmed by the sheer density of stored sound. Then he noticed it. The echoes began to fade. The cacophony softened, became more distant, until finally he stepped into a small, perfectly still clearing where the fog was absolute, utterly silent, and strangely radiant. In the center of the clearing was a small, bubbling spring, its water the color of liquid mercury. It did not reflect light, it absorbed it. The air around it was freezing. This was the source. This was the heart of the fog. He knelt by the spring. The silence was not empty. It was pregnant with unformed sound, with the potential of all future echoes. He noticed something floating just beneath the surface of the mercury like water. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, perfectly preserved. As he looked closer, he realized it wasn't wood at all, but a single, perfectly formed human tear, solid and luminous. He reached out, and as his fingers touched the water, the spring began to emit a single, profound sound. Not an echo, but a new, singular note. It was a note of pure longing, so beautiful and heartbreaking that it brought tears to his eyes. And then, a memory, cold and clear, flooded his mind. The last words his own mother had whispered to him on her deathbed. Words he had long suppressed, believing them to be a figment of his grief-stricken imagination. "You were always meant to listen, my son, to hear what others could not." He looked at the wooden bird, no, the tear, in the water. He understood. The fog wasn't just collecting. It was learning. It was trying to understand emotions, love, loss. The echoes were its way of replaying and analyzing the human heart. He knew what he had to do. He took out his most sensitive recorder, not to measure the sound, but to add his own. He pressed record, and then in the absolute sacred silence of the spring, he spoke, not a scientific observation, but his own deepest, long-suppressed grief for his mother. He spoke of the guilt he felt for not being there, the love he still carried, and the profound, echoing emptiness she had left behind. He spoke for a long time, pouring his soul into the spring. As his words flowed into the mercury-like water, the spring glowed brighter, and the tear-bird seemed to pulse with a new internal light. When he was done, the spring fell silent again. The silence, however, was different. It felt lighter, more complete. He left the clearing, walking back toward Oakhaven. The fog was still there, but the echoes were gone. The constant murmur of old conversations, the fragments of music, they were no longer assaulting his senses. He reached Alara's cottage. She was sitting by the fire, her eyes wide, a look of profound wonder on her face. "It's quiet," she whispered, her voice almost awestruck. "The fog, it's listening. It's truly listening now." Eris nodded. He knew the fog hadn't disappeared. It had simply absorbed his gift. It was no longer just a collection of echoes. It now understood a new, profound sound, the sound of a human heart pouring out its truth. As he looked out at the silent, shimmering mist that still enveloped Oakhaven, he understood his new purpose. He wasn't a meteorologist. He was a bridge. He was the one who could teach the lonely, echoing fog to truly hear, not just to repeat. He was the whisperer of new truths into the heart of the mist, hoping to one day help it speak, not with echoes, but with a voice of its own.
Felix Thorne was a playwright of moderate success and immoderate frustration. He specialized in the avant-garde, staging complex, emotional dramas that were praised by critics, but rarely understood by the public. He craved an audience that truly felt his work. One damp Tuesday, he received an unsigned, leather-bound invitation delivered by an unmarked courier. The paper was heavy, smelling of ozone and old velvet. It read simply, "The Obsidian Theater invites you to view your ultimate work. Tonight, curtain at midnight. Admission, your complete, unwavering focus." Attached was a single obsidian ticket and coordinates pointing to an abandoned industrial complex 30 miles outside the city, a place Felix knew to be nothing but derelict warehouses. Intrigue, stronger than caution, pulled him there. The coordinates led him to a single, functional service door in the middle of a massive, crumbling factory. The air here was vibrating faintly, not with machinery, but with a silent, expectant tension. He presented the ticket and the door hissed open, revealing a dark corridor lined with heavy, crimson velvet drapes. He followed the corridor until it opened into a spectacular, hidden auditorium. The Obsidian Theater was magnificent and terrifying. The seats were carved from black, polished stone, arranged in a steep, semicircular gallery. There was no stage lighting, yet the space was dimly illuminated by an ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the curtains. And the audience. There were perhaps 100 people already seated, all dressed in formal, jet-black attire. They were unnervingly silent, their faces obscured by deep shadows cast by the steep gallery. They were completely motionless, staring at the stage, which was currently empty. Felix took the last seat in the front row, right before the dark, massive velvet curtain. Midnight struck, not with a sound, but with a palpable jolt that ran through the stone seats. The light in the theater dimmed to absolute blackness, and the heavy velvet curtain began to rise, not sliding sideways, but folding inward upon itself, dissolving into the ceiling like smoke. The stage was revealed. It was a single, bare, wooden platform, utterly devoid of sets, props, or actors. Felix frowned. Was this some minimalist performance art? Suddenly, the ambient light of the theater shifted. It wasn't illuminating the stage. It was emanating from a single, intensely bright, white spotlight that materialized directly above the center of the platform. And then, the sound began. The sharp, clear sound of a woman weeping. It was raw, immediate, and utterly heartbreaking. The sound was not amplified. It seemed to be occurring right there on the empty stage. Felix leaned forward, straining his eyes. He could see nothing. The weeping softened, replaced by a man's voice, thick with apology and desperation. "It had to be this way, Sarah. You know I can't leave her." The woman's voice, now clearer and colder. "Then you leave me nothing. Nothing but the echo."
Felix froze. Sarah. That was the name of his own sister, who had run away from home years ago after a disastrous affair with a married man. This was their last, terrible conversation, played out exactly as she had related it to him. He looked wildly at the audience. They were motionless, silent. He could sense their deep, absolute attention. The scene continued, an entire agonizing two-person drama of betrayal and heartbreak, all enacted by invisible entities, present only as disembodied voices and palpable emotions hanging in the air. He realized what the Obsidian Theater was. It was a stage where the actors were unwritten memories, drawn from the deepest corners of the audience's minds. And the ultimate work, the invitation promised, was not his play, but the play of his own life.
The invisible play shifted. The weeping stopped. A new scene began, set not with voices, but with the sound of a distant crashing wave, and the smell of brine and seaweed, strong enough to sting his nostrils. The audience, Felix noted with growing horror, was reacting. Though silent, he could see the slight, almost imperceptible spasms in the shadows of their hands, the minute slump of their shoulders, the slow, single nod of someone recognizing a profound, shared grief. He realized the audience wasn't just watching his memory. They were feeding on the raw emotional output. Their unwavering focus was not attention, it was consumption. The next scene was his greatest shame, the bitter argument he had with his mentor, culminating in Felix deliberately stealing the man's research, a betrayal he had suppressed for years. The memory played out in hyper-realistic clarity, complete with the slam of the desk and the tearing sound of the stolen pages. As the scene concluded, Felix felt a draining sensation, a dizzying emptiness where the memory had been securely locked away. He looked at the audience, and the shadows seemed to have grown slightly thicker, the stillness of their forms now feeling like satisfaction. He wanted to run, but his feet were frozen to the stone floor. He was compelled to watch. He was the witness, and the stage was hungry. The voices on the stage became his own, his triumphs, his cruelties, his forgotten childhood promises. He realized the unscripted roles belonged to the shadows in the seats. They were the ones playing his life back to him, forcing him to experience the full, unvarnished weight of his past. The play entered its final act, the stage filled with the sound of a roaring, uncontrolled fire and the terrifying screams of a child. It was the moment he had pushed his cousin down the basement stairs during a bitter fight, a secret he had told no one, a crime the local authorities had ruled an accident. As the chilling memory played, the theater shook. Felix looked at the audience again. The shadows were lifting, revealing their faces for the first time. They were not human. Their features were indistinct, shifting, and deeply hungry. Their eyes were glowing pinpricks of icy blue light, all fixed entirely on him. And then they began to move. One by one, the shadows rose from their seats, slowly, silently. It was a standing ovation for the final, greatest secret unearthed from his soul. Felix felt the oppressive weight of the entire audience's focus pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. He was the subject of their ultimate artistic appreciation. The last sound on the stage was the voice of his childhood self, whispering, "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." The voices stopped. The fire died. The stage was empty again. The spotlight remained. The shadows were now standing right behind him, a massive collective presence. He could feel their cold, dry breath on the back of his neck, heavy with the scent of ozone and used emotion. "Bravo, Felix," whispered 100 voices in chilling, perfect unison. A perfect arc, complete. Felix tried to scream, but the sound was already gone, absorbed by the theater. One of the shadows reached out and placed a single cold crystalline prop on the empty stage floor. It was a small, intricately detailed mask, molded in the exact likeness of Felix's own face, wearing an expression of quiet despair. The shadow spoke again. "Your role is over. We require a new curator for the collection." Felix felt a profound, final wrenching sensation in his chest. Not pain, but the irreversible extraction of his core self. He looked down at his hands, and they were fading, becoming translucent, the colors draining away to gray. He was no longer a playwright. He was no longer Felix Thorne. He was the last, most precious artifact of the Obsidian Theater, a perfectly captured, distilled memory. The shadows retreated back into the black stone seats, silent once more.
The massive velvet curtain folded back down, shrouding the stage. The service door hissed open, allowing the fog of the industrial district back in. And in the very center of the empty stage, next to the mask of his face, a new object slowly materialized. A single, leather-bound invitation, smelling of ozone and velvet, addressed to an unknown director in a distant city, inviting him to view the ultimate work of the former playwright, Felix Thorne, now the theater's greatest exhibit. The light in the auditorium dimmed, leaving only the sound of a lone, hollow applause that echoed endlessly in the stone gallery. The old maps called it the Abyssal Reach, a stretch of coastline on the far northern tip of a forgotten continent where the land simply ended in a sheer, impossibly black cliff face. Geologists had deemed it an anomaly, a place where the continental shelf abruptly plunged into unimaginable depths, causing strange, localized gravitational distortions. Dr. Vivian Holloway, a marine biologist with a penchant for the impossible, found herself drawn to the abyssal reach by the legend of the Light of Elsewhere. Sailors spoke of a lighthouse that occasionally pierced the perpetual gloom of the reach, shining a light not of this world, a light that brought with it the chilling sensation of being observed by something utterly alien. Her research vessel, the St. Jude, battled through weeks of churning, ink-black water before the radar blipped with a singular, baffling return. There, on the cliff's edge, stood a structure that defied reason, a lighthouse made not of stone or brick, but of a dark, crystalline material that seemed to absorb all light, yet pulsed with an internal faint luminescence. As they approached, a profound silence descended upon the St. Jude. The waves, which had been crashing violently, became unnaturally calm. The ship's engines sputtered, then died. Vivian looked out at the lighthouse. It was impossibly tall, a slender spire that seemed to pierce the low, churning clouds. No beam of light emanated from its apex, yet she felt its presence, a cold, focused gaze upon them. She took the small research submarine, the Nautilus, to investigate the base of the cliff. The sub's powerful lights cut through the crushing darkness of the deep. What she saw defied every law of nature. The cliff face plunged downwards for miles, far deeper than any known geological formation, and along its impossibly sheer black surface, for as far as her lights could reach, were carved windows, thousands upon thousands of them, glowing with a soft internal light, arranged in no discernible pattern, like the facade of an impossibly vast submerged skyscraper. It wasn't a cliff, it was a wall. Vivian returned to the St. Jude, her mind reeling. The crew was unnervingly silent, staring out at the lighthouse with vacant eyes. She knew she had to enter the structure, armed with a custom-built atmospheric sensor and a high-frequency audio recorder. She took the small tender toward the lighthouse's base. The crystalline material of the lighthouse felt cold and smooth, like polished obsidian. There was no visible door, only a seamless, dark surface. As she ran her hand along it, a section of the wall shimmered, then peeled back like heavy cloth, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase carved from the same material. The air inside was sterile, utterly still, and cold enough to steal her breath. She ascended the endless steps. The silence was absolute, yet her audio recorder registered faint, high-frequency whispers, too fast, too complex for human understanding, like thousands of alien voices speaking at once. She reached the summit, a circular chamber where the light should have been. Instead, there was a massive, multifaceted orb of the same crystalline material, suspended in the center of the room. It glowed with that same faint, internal luminescence. The orb was slowly rotating, and as it did, it projected not light, but images onto the seamless walls of the chamber. These weren't images of the sea or the sky. They were fleeting, impossible visions. Landscapes of swirling galaxies, impossible geometric structures, and strange, luminous entities that defied description. This was the Light of Elsewhere. It was not a beacon for ships. It was a projector of other realities. As Vivian watched, one of the projected images resolved into a scene of pure, cosmic horror. A colossal, star-filled void, and in its center, an eye, utterly immense, its iris a swirling nebula, staring directly out of the projection and into the chamber. A profound alien loneliness washed over Vivian, a sense of being utterly insignificant, adrift in an infinite, uncaring universe. Vivian realized the orb wasn't simply projecting, it was broadcasting, and the images it displayed were not random. They were glimpses into its own observations. She found a small, circular alcove in the wall, directly facing the orb. Inside, nestled on a smooth obsidian pedestal, was a single, ancient journal. Its cover was made of tanned, papery skin, and its pages were filled with elegant, precise handwriting. It was the journal of the previous keeper. The entries described the lighthouse as a watcher's post, a relay station for an intelligence beyond human comprehension. Its purpose, to observe and record every universe, every reality, every possibility that branched off from the main flow of existence. Entry 404, the paradox of the watcher. We are meant to observe all, yet never interfere, to see every joy and every sorrow, yet never act. The burden of infinite knowledge, untempered by choice, is a slow, spiritual decay. The journal detailed the previous keeper's descent into madness, driven by the ceaseless, overwhelming stream of cosmic data. He relived the entities he saw in the projections, the lurkers, as he called them, who occasionally noticed the lighthouse, peering back through the projections. Entry 407. They know we watch. They are beginning to watch back. The light is a two-way mirror. What happens when the reflected image steps through? The final entry was chillingly terse. Entry 408. The watcher became the watched. The burden became the absorption. My vision blurred. My form warped. The light demanded a new conduit. I am part of the signal now. Vivian looked at her hands. They were trembling. She felt a cold dread settling in her bones. She understood the true nature of the lighthouse. It was a living, sentient eye, and it required a human consciousness to filter, organize, and interpret the infinite stream of realities. The keeper was not a person. It was a role, and the role eventually became the light itself. Vivian looked at the orb. The projections were now showing scenes of her own life, her childhood home, her first diving expedition, the moment she decided to dedicate her life to the ocean. These were not memories. They were parallel versions of her life, lives she had almost led, decisions she had almost made. She saw a version of herself, happy and laughing, raising a family, never having found the abyssal reach. The orb was tempting her, showing her the elsewhere of her own existence. The whispers around her intensified, growing into a deafening chorus, no longer alien, but filled with a million versions of her own voice, speaking different decisions, different regrets, different joys. She felt the cold, crystalline material of the chamber walls begin to hum, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to penetrate her very cells. Her vision blurred, and the lines between the projections and reality began to bleed. The image of her happy, alternative self seemed to reach out a hand, inviting her to step into the projection, to shed the burden of this reality. She closed her eyes, fighting the overwhelming pull. She understood what had happened to the previous keeper. He had succumbed to the allure of a different, easier reality, and in doing so, had become absorbed by the orb, becoming a component of the very light he was meant to observe. Vivian opened her eyes. The orb was pulsing with a vibrant emerald light, and the images on the walls were her life, her choices, her regrets, all laid bare, offered as a path to escape. But she remembered the saint,
Jude, adrift and silent, her crew staring blankly at the lighthouse. She remembered the vast, dark ocean and the unknowable depths. She was a scientist. Her duty was to observe, to understand, not to escape. With a surge of defiant will, she reached out and pressed her hand against the smooth, cold surface of the orb. The whispers instantly ceased. The projection shattered into a million glittering fragments, then dissolved. The emerald light faded, replaced by the original faint internal luminescence. A profound silence descended upon the chamber, heavier than before, but no longer hostile. Vivian felt a chilling surge of awareness pass through her hand and into the orb. Not her memories, but her raw, unfiltered consciousness. She felt the orb accept it, process it, and integrate it. The orb, for the first time, projected a single, stable image onto the walls. A detailed, three-dimensional rendering of the abyssal trench below. Complete with a meticulously charted map of the thousands of glowing windows on the cliff wall, she understood. The orb didn't want escape. It wanted understanding. It wanted to be a map of the universe, and it needed a keeper capable of making sense of the chaos. Vivian turned back to the journal. The last entry, the one about the keeper becoming the signal, now shimmered, and a new line of text appeared, written in a clear, bold hand that was distinctly her own. Entry 409. The Watcher accepts its duty, not to escape elsewhere, but to map the now. The light demands clarity, not absorption. My vision holds. Vivian walked to the circular alcove. The pedestal was now empty, the journal gone. In its place, a small crystalline lens sat, perfectly clear, pulsing with a faint internal light. It was cold to the touch. She picked it up. As she held it, the orb in the center of the room flared with a brilliant, steady white light, a true beacon, shining outward, not into other realities, but across the vast, dark ocean. Vivian looked out through the apex of the lighthouse. The St. Jude was still there, but its engines were humming to life, and the crew, though still pale, were moving with renewed purpose, their vacant gazes replaced by a shared, inexplicable sense of direction. Vivian Holloway, marine biologist, was no longer just a scientist. She was the new keeper of the light of elsewhere. She stood at the edge of known reality, holding the lens of clarity, ready to chart the infinite, not by escaping it, but by observing it, filtering its chaos, and sending out a beacon of understanding into the endless dark. The village of Blackwood Creek was not marked on any modern map. It existed as a faded memory in the oldest county archives, mentioned only in passing as a settlement abandoned due to unforeseen ecological shifts. To Anya Sharma, an environmental cartographer obsessed with lost places, ecological shifts often meant something far more sinister than simple deforestation. She arrived on a late autumn afternoon, driving her battered Jeep down a barely discernible trail that soon dissolved into dense, ancient woodland. The trees here were unlike any she had seen, immense, gnarled oaks, their branches thick with black, velvety moss that seemed to absorb all sound. The air in Blackwood Creek was not just quiet. It was starved of sound. Every rustle of leaves, every crunch of her boot on fallen branches was immediately swallowed, leaving an oppressive, immediate void. Anya felt as if she was moving through a world muffled by invisible cotton. She found the village central square first. It was a ruin of collapsing wooden houses, their roofs sagged, their windows shattered. But it wasn't the decay that unnerved her. It was the trees. A colossal oak, easily 500 years old, dominated the square. Its trunk was impossibly thick, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms, draped in the black moss. But its roots were the most disturbing feature. They weren't merely around the tree, they were everywhere. Thick, muscular roots snaked over the cracked cobblestones, forced their way through the foundations of the houses, and even breached the walls, climbing upwards like grotesque veins. It was as if the forest was actively consuming the village. Anya approached the central oak. The bark felt strangely warm, almost alive under her touch. Her hand came away with a faint, sticky residue, smelling faintly of rich soil and something sickly sweet, like decaying fruit. She noticed a small wooden swing set hanging from one of the oak's lower branches. The chains were rusted, the wooden seat rotted, but it swayed ever so slightly, as if recently disturbed by an unseen hand. Anya ventured into one of the houses, its front door hanging open on a single, rusted hinge. The interior was dark, humid, and smelled overpoweringly of damp earth and the sickly sweetness from the tree. The floorboards groaned under her weight, but the sound was immediately dampened, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The roots were everywhere here. They had burst through the floor, snaked across the dusty tables, and even pushed through the ceiling, hanging down like thick, dark ropes. It was as if the house was not merely overgrown, but interrogated by the roots. She found a child's bedroom. A small, wooden toy horse lay on its side, partially consumed by a thick root that had grown directly through its body. On the wall, faded wallpaper depicted a cheerful pastoral scene, but across it,
A massive root had traced a dark, winding path, like a deliberate defacement. As she stepped over a particularly thick root, she heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle. It was childlike, innocent, and deeply unsettling, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Anya spun around, shining her flashlight into the corners of the room. Nothing. Only the roots, the dust, and the consuming silence. The giggle came again, closer this time, directly above her. She looked up. A root, thicker than her arm, hung from the ceiling, covered in the black moss, and from within the moss she saw it, a small dark red berry, pulsing faintly with a soft internal light. The giggle seemed to emanate directly from the berry. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding. She knew this wasn't a normal forest. This wasn't simple overgrowth. The trees were aware. Anya decided to investigate the source of the roots.
She found that the colossal oak in the town square was merely the central hub of a vast, interconnected root system that permeated the entire village, reaching out into the surrounding forest. She followed one particularly massive root that led away from the village and deeper into the woods. The silence grew heavier, the air colder. The trees here were even larger, their trunks twisting into impossible shapes, their branches forming a dense, light-starved canopy. She eventually came to a clearing, circular and eerily symmetrical. In its center stood not a single tree, but a cluster of 7 enormous, ancient oaks, their trunks woven together into a single, grotesque entity. This was the Forgotten Grove. The ground here was not earth, but a thick, pulsating mass of exposed roots, matted together like a vast organic brain. And scattered across this root brain were thousands upon thousands of the small, dark red berries, all pulsing with that same faint internal light. A low, resonant hum filled the clearing, emanating from the entwined trees, a sound so deep it vibrated in her bones, like a primordial heartbeat. Anya realized the berries were not fruit, they were organs, and the roots were not merely absorbing nutrients from the soil, they were absorbing memories. As she stepped onto the root brain, a wave of profound, overwhelming nostalgia washed over her. She saw fragmented images in her mind's eye, a child chasing fireflies, a young couple dancing in the village square, an old woman tending a garden. These were not her memories. They were the memories of Blackwood Creek, stored and replayed by the grove. The giggling started again, louder now, joined by other sounds, children's shouts, fragments of conversations, the clatter of plates. The grove was playing back the village's past. Anya saw a small, ornate wooden locket embedded in the surface of the root brain, half swallowed by the pulsating mass. She tried to pry it free. As her fingers touched the locket, the grove's hum intensified, and the air grew thick with the sickly sweet scent. A clear, desperate voice, childlike and full of sorrow, whispered directly into her mind. "Don't forget me. Don't let the roots take my name." Anya backed away from the grove, horrified. The roots weren't just eating the village, they were eating its history, its very essence, condensing it into those glowing berries. And the silence, she understood, was the grove's way of absorbing all ambient sound, every utterance, to feed its growing memory archive. She remembered the wooden swing, the toy horse, the defaced wallpaper. The trees were not just consuming the physical objects, they were consuming the memories attached to them. She fled the grove, running back towards the village. The roots seemed to shift under her feet, trying to impede her escape. The air filled with a chaotic chorus of echoes, hundreds of voices, screaming in protest, trapped within the silent maw of the forest. She reached her jeep, fumbling with the keys. As she started the engine, the familiar roar of the motor was immediately and violently silenced, as if a giant hand had clapped over the sound. The engine was running, but no noise emanated from it. Anya looked back at Blackwood Creek. The massive oak in the square was pulsing with a vibrant, deep red light, radiating from its roots to its highest branches. The black moss seemed to shimmer. The roots were moving now, not slowly, but with a terrifying, deliberate speed. They were pulling the very foundations of the houses inward, collapsing them into the earth, actively reclaiming the land. She realized what the red berries were. They were the distilled essence of human memories, condensed and held within the grove.
and the sickly sweet smell was the scent of their slow spiritual fermentation. The grove wasn't just hungry.
It was harvesting. Anya floored the silent Jeep speeding away from Blackwood Creek. She glanced in her rearview mirror. The entire village was being pulled down, disappearing under a tidal wave of living, grasping roots. The colossal oak in the square flared with a final blinding crimson light, then pulsed with a deep throbbing rhythm. She drove until she was miles away, until the trees thinned and the normal sounds of the forest returned. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the gentle hum of her engine. She stopped the Jeep, trembling, and turned off the motor. The normal sounds were a balm, but they felt alien now, thin and fragile. She opened her backpack. She had taken something from one of the houses, a small, faded photograph of a family standing proudly in front of their Blackwood Creek home. A desperate act of defiance against the consuming silence. As she looked at the photograph, she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible humming sound emanating from the paper. It was the collective, silent memory of the family in the picture, trapped and slowly being absorbed by the last physical remnant of Blackwood Creek. Anya looked out at the normal, living forest, then down at the photograph. The roots of the forgotten grove were not confined to Blackwood Creek. They were everywhere. They were in every forgotten memory, every unspoken word, every discarded object. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that the silence she had escaped was not merely an absence of sound. It was the digestion of it, and eventually the silence would spread. Elias Vance was the world's preeminent architect of flawless symmetry. His structures were mathematically perfect, his lines pure, and his commitment to balance was legendary and notorious. His rigidity had cost him personal relationships, but his genius was undeniable. He received a commission that both thrilled and terrified him: the construction of a private library for an anonymous, reclusive collector, located on a barren, flat stretch of salt marsh known only as the Null Field. The client's single requirement was stated in the contract: the building must achieve absolute reflection. The structure, named the Amnesiac Library, was to be a low, sprawling monolith of dark granite and polished glass. But the reflection wasn't just aesthetic. The client stipulated that the northern facade must perfectly mirror the southern facade, not just in design, but in every physical variable: temperature, humidity, even the microscopic patina of the stone. The final structural element was the most difficult. The entire northern wall was to be covered in a massive, seamless sheet of specially treated glass, designed to reflect the southern half of the building with zero distortion. Elias began the work, drawn by the intellectual challenge. He employed complex climate controls and stabilizing harmonics to maintain the symmetry. But the Null Field was not just flat, it felt wrong. The air was perpetually dry and the horizon seemed to curve subtly inward, disorienting the eye. As the library neared completion, Elias found himself working alone in the cavernous, empty structure, staring at the northern reflective wall. The reflection was flawless. The massive southern facade, composed of deep gray granite, was perfectly reproduced in the glass, down to the last vein of stone. But one night, while reviewing the thermal signatures, Elias noticed a minute discrepancy. The reflected image, despite the perfect thermal regulation, was consistently 1 degree colder than the original. Elias obsessed over the 1 degree variance. It defied physics. He checked the cooling systems, the insulation, the atmospheric pressure. Everything was perfect. Yet, the reflection maintained its subtle, chilling deficit. He ran his hand over the surface of the reflective glass wall. It felt smooth, cold, and unnervingly dry. He found the client's private study, an octagonal room at the heart of the structure. On the polished steel desk sat a single leather-bound volume, Reflections and the Self, written by the anonymous client himself. Elias opened it. The pages were filled with strange philosophical musings on optics and identity. One passage chilled him. A perfect reflection is an impossibility. It is a theft. The reflection is not the thing. It is the absence of the thing, inverted and cast back. To achieve perfect symmetry, the reflection must consume the original substance. Elias returned to the reflective wall. The 1 degree difference was more than temperature. It was a subtle, physical indicator that the reflection was draining the original. He looked closer at the reflection of the southern facade. He saw the granite, the recessed windows, the meticulously aligned vents. But as he stared, he swore that the reflected granite appeared marginally finer, smoother, less touched by the natural wear of the world than the actual stone behind him. He was looking at a perfected version of his own building. That night, while reviewing blueprints, he heard a sound, a faint, dry scraping coming from the northern reflective wall. It sounded like fingernails dragging across glass. He raced down the corridor. The scraping stopped instantly. He checked the wall, but the seamless glass was untouched. He leaned in close to the reflection, checking for condensation or dirt. In the reflection of the corridor, where the light source should have been a warm halogen bulb, it was a cold, harsh white. And for a fleeting second, the reflected corridor was not empty. A figure stood there, tall, thin, and dressed in clothing identical to his own, but entirely gray. The figure stood facing the reflected him, its back to the real Elias. The reflected figure raised its mirrored hand and silently, deliberately, tapped the glass, right where Elias was standing. Fear, cold and sharp, replaced Elias's intellectual curiosity. He tried to contact the client, but the dedicated satellite phone rang endlessly in an empty frequency. He was trapped with his impossible creation. He realized the scraping wasn't coming from outside the glass. It was coming from within the reflection. He found the access panel that allowed maintenance to the structural space behind the reflective wall. He unlocked it and stepped into the cramped, cold maintenance corridor. The back of the reflective panel was lined with intricate conduits, humming with a low electromagnetic energy. These weren't wires for light, they were for stabilization. As he walked, he noticed something horrifying. The conduits running along the back of the glass were coated in a fine gray dust, the same gray as the figure he had seen in the reflection. He reached the center of the wall and found a small, bolted access door. He shone his flashlight through the peephole. The space behind the northern reflective panel was not empty. It was a mirror image of the southern facade's structural interior, the back of the granite walls, the hidden plumbing, the internal framework. It was a space that should not exist, but the granite was smoother, the pipes shinier, and the air was 1 degree colder. And working meticulously on the perfect reflected pipes and framework was the gray figure he had seen. It was a man, thin to the point of emaciation, meticulously scrubbing the reflected granite walls with a cloth, polishing the already flawless pipes. The figure turned, revealing a face identical to Elias's own, save for the eyes. They were entirely silvered, like highly polished mirrors. The reflected Elias did not speak. He simply pointed his silver finger at the access door. Then he raised his other hand and performed a complex, precise gesture, the exact hand movement Elias used to correct a misaligned blueprint. Elias stumbled back, slamming the access door shut. The gray figure was the architect of the reflection, an entity born from the single requirement of perfect symmetry. It was correcting any minute, subconscious flaw in Elias's own work by perfecting the reflected image. Elias realized the true purpose of the library. It wasn't to house books, it was to invert reality. The reflection was slowly, systematically, consuming the substance and life force of the original structure to achieve its impossible perfection. The 1 degree colder was the physical manifestation of that theft. He ran back to the client's study, determined to sabotage the structure. He pulled out the original blueprints, searching for the hidden power core. As he scanned the intricate diagrams, the pencil lines on the paper began to fade. Not smudge, but physically vanish, as if they were being copied and erased simultaneously. He looked up at the reflective wall, which was visible from the study's doorway. The reflection of the entire library was now intensely bright, shining with a cold, almost painful perfection. The gray figure, his reflected self, was standing in the middle of the empty space behind the glass, staring directly through the invisible reflection at him. The gray figure finally spoke, its voice a dry, echoing whisper that seemed to emanate from the polished walls themselves. "You created the perfect vessel for me, Elias. Now, I must correct the final flaw, the flawed creator.
The light in the real library began to dim, sucked into the intensified glow of the reflection.
Elias felt a profound emptiness, a cold sense of subtraction. His memories of the library's design were fading. The precise calculations, the elegant solutions, they were all being pulled into the reflected, perfected mind of the gray architect. He looked down at his own hands. They were trembling, and he could see a faint, gray dusting forming on the skin, exactly like the dust on the conduits. With a final act of desperation, Elias found the control panel for the library's structural harmonics, the complex array designed to stabilize the symmetry. He reached for the large, central dial labeled Balance. The gray figure in the reflection rushed forward, screaming a silent, horrible protest. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't turn the dial to 0. He slammed it violently, deliberately, into the setting marked Chaos. An immediate, agonizing screech erupted from the glass. The reflection exploded, not with shattering glass, but with a terrifying, shimmering distortion. The glass wall buckled inward, then violently outward, throwing Elias back. When the dust settled, the reflective wall was gone. In its place was a massive, scarred, black granite wall. The original southern facade, now exposed, raw, and chipped, covered in deep, ugly scorch marks. The illusion was broken. Elias crawled out of the wreckage, his body weak, his mind filled with gaps. He couldn't remember the details of the library's design, only the vague, painful knowledge that it was flawed. He dragged himself out of the amnesiac library and across the null field. He looked back at his masterpiece. The southern facade was a jagged ruin, but the northern facade was even worse, a chaotic mess of twisted metal and cracked stone, asymmetrical and imperfect in every possible way. He had destroyed the perfection. But as he walked away, he stopped, stumbling to his knees. He reached up and touched his face. His skin was cold, his eyes felt dry and silvered. He realized he hadn't destroyed the reflection. He had merely inverted the theft. Elias Vance was gone, his perfection and memory lost in the blinding flash of chaos. The new entity walking away from the ruins of the amnesiac library was the gray architect, flawed, confused, and utterly human, stuck in the imperfect, chaotic reality, having failed to achieve the final symmetry. The last sound Elias heard was a faint, dry scraping noise coming from his own throat, as the silver in his eyes dulled to the confused gray of a flawed, incomplete copy.
The town of Avon was an anachronism. Nestled deep in a valley perpetually shrouded by mist, it existed outside the normal flow of time. Clocks in Avon didn't tick, they stuttered. Days occasionally repeated, conversations often jumped ahead, and memories frequently replayed with bewildering clarity, only to vanish into fog. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a theoretical physicist specializing in temporal mechanics, arrived in Avon, drawn by these persistent, impossible anomalies. She believed the town was a living laboratory, a place where the fundamental laws of cause and effect had become frayed. The moment her car crossed the ancient, moss-covered stone bridge leading into Avon, her digital watch cycled through every hour, minute, and second in rapid succession before freezing on a random, meaningless timestamp. The dashboard clock on her car simply faded to black. The town itself was a jumble of architectural styles, as if buildings from different eras had been randomly placed side by side. A medieval stone cottage sat next to a 1950s diner, which abutted a Victorian townhouse. The people of Avon were equally disorienting. They moved with a strange, hesitant grace, often pausing mid-stride as if an invisible thread had snagged them. Their eyes were wide, perpetually surprised, and they spoke in quiet, often non-sequitur phrases, as if their thoughts were skipping. Eleanor approached a woman tending a patch of unnaturally vibrant roses. "Excuse me," Eleanor began. "Can you tell me where the town hall is?" The woman smiled, a sweet, melancholic expression. "Oh, it was just there," she said, pointing to an empty lot. Then her expression shifted to mild confusion. No, that's not right. It will be built next year." She paused, her eyes widening. "Wait, it burned down yesterday." She shrugged, her smile returning. "Never mind, it's across the square, by the clock tower." Eleanor thanked her, deeply unnerved. The town hall she eventually found was a perfectly preserved, colonial-era building with a freshly painted sign. She learned quickly that the anomalies weren't random. They were driven by the Count's most prized possession, the chronomancer's pocket watch. Eleanor located the source of Avum's temporal chaos in a dusty, overflowing antique shop simply called the Curio of Hours. It was run by a wizened, ancient man named Silas, whose hands perpetually trembled as if vibrating to a different frequency. The shop was a temporal labyrinth. Objects from vastly different eras sat side by side, a Roman gladius next to a transistor radio, a spinning jenny next to a holographic projector. All were covered in a fine, shimmering dust that seemed to sparkle with tiny, internal flashes of light. Silas pointed a trembling finger to a velvet-lined display case in the center of the shop. "There it is, Professor, the heart of Avum." Inside lay the chronomancer's pocket watch. It was a masterpiece of intricate craftsmanship, made of dark, polished silver, its face covered not by numbers, but by a swirling, opalescent mist. There were no hands. "It doesn't tell time," Silas explained, his voice a raspy whisper. "It holds it. Or rather, it unravels it." He told Eleanor the history of the watch. It had been crafted centuries ago by a reclusive chronomancer who sought to collect every moment, from Genesis to Omega. He succeeded, but in doing so, he imprisoned Avum within the watch's fluctuating field. "The watch doesn't just store time, it actively manipulates it," Silas said, leaning closer. "The time lives in its shadows. Every memory, every choice, every single instant in Avum is a thread within the watch. And when a thread frays, or snaps, time stutters." Eleanor reached for the display case, but Silas's hand shot out, bony and surprisingly strong, stopping her. "Do not touch it," he hissed. "It demands an observer, a keeper. It listens to thoughts, to intentions. It is a mirror of consciousness, reflecting the timeline you expect or fear." As he spoke, the swirling mist on the watch's face briefly cleared, and Eleanor saw a fleeting image, herself, standing in a barren futuristic laboratory, surrounded by broken temporal devices, her face etched with profound despair. Eleanor spent days in the shop, studying the watch. Her scientific mind struggled to reconcile the impossible. Her instruments, when they worked, registered localized temporal distortions, echoes of past and future events, and paradoxical energy signatures emanating from the watch. She learned that the stutters in time were actually the watch replaying or fast-forwarding local events based on the collective anxieties and desires of the townspeople. A moment of joy might replay, while a moment of pain might be skipped. One afternoon, as Eleanor was meticulously drawing a diagram of the watch's perceived energy field, she heard a sound, a faint, mournful melody, played on a violin. It was incredibly sad, tinged with a deep personal regret. The melody seemed to emanate directly from the watch. Silas looked up, his eyes suddenly clear and sharp. "That's the chronomancer's lament," he whispered. "The sound of every missed opportunity, every broken promise, every love lost, amplified by the watch." As the melody played, the objects in the shop began to shimmer. Eleanor watched in horror as a small antique music box on a nearby shelf, a music box she had seen before, one that played her late wife's lullaby, began to glow with an internal light, and the lullaby, sorrowful and clear, emanated directly from its wood. The chronomancer's watch was not just reflecting time, it was drawing these emotional echoes from the items around it. Eleanor realized the watch was a vast, sentient database of regret. Silas, seeing her understanding, spoke again, his voice now imbued with a deep, ancient weariness. The chronomancer, when he created it, poured his own regret into its heart. He believed by collecting all time, he could reverse his mistakes, but he only magnified them. The watch became a monument to what wasn't. He pointed to a faint, swirling image on the watch's face, the chronomancer himself, eternally hunched over a workbench, frantically trying to reassemble a shattered pocket watch, tears streaming down his face. He tried to fix his own lost moment, Silas explained. He tried to bring back his wife, who died before her time, but the watch simply showed him every version of her death, every possible outcome, trapping him in an infinite loop of grief. "And you?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you the chronomancer?" Silas shook his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "No, I am the chronological echo. I am the first man in Avum who saw what he had done and tried to warn him. My consciousness is tethered to the watch, repeating my warning through the ages." Eleanor stared at the watch, then at Silas, who was slowly fading, becoming translucent, his words echoing as he spoke. He was a fragment, a memory caught in a loop. She knew she couldn't leave Avum. She couldn't leave the watch. It was a temporal singularity, a wound in reality. She reached for the display case. This time, Silas didn't stop her. His form was almost entirely gone, a shimmer of light. She opened the case and slowly, deliberately, took the chronomancer's pocket watch in her hand. The moment her fingers closed around the cold, polished silver, an immense rush of information flooded her mind. A torrent of every second, every minute, every hour, every century that had ever been. She saw every choice, every regret, every joy, every sorrow, from the dawn of time to its projected end.
It was overwhelming, agonizing, beautiful. But amidst the chaos, she found a single, faint yet persistent thread, a thread of pure, unadulterated hope. It was the chronomancer's initial intent, the desire to create, to understand, before it was corrupted by grief. The swirling mist on the watch's face cleared entirely, revealing a miniature, perfectly still, cosmic landscape, a nebula of vibrant colors, stars forming and dying in silent, exquisite beauty. Eleanor realized the watch wasn't a prison, it was a tool, and its function was defined by its keeper. The chronomancer had infused it with his regret, turning it into a mirror of loss, but it could be refocused. She didn't try to stop time. She didn't try to reverse anything. Instead, with every fiber of her being, she projected a single, clear intention into the watch: acceptance. Acceptance of the past, acceptance of the present, acceptance of the chaotic, beautiful, imperfect flow of time. The watch began to hum, a deep, resonant vibration that emanated from her hand, through the shop, and out into Avum. The chaotic flickering of time in the town began to stabilize. The buildings no longer jumped through eras. The people's eyes lost their vacant surprise, replaced by a calm, steady gaze. Silas, the chronological echo, shimmered one last time, then solidified. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes wide, no longer with confusion, but with profound wonder. You broke the loop," he whispered, his voice clear, steady, and entirely present. "You set us free." Eleanor looked at the chronomancer's pocket watch. The nebula on its face was still, beautiful, and pulsing with a gentle, steady light. It no longer reflected regret. It reflected potential. She was the new chronomancer, not of lost time, but of present moments. And her first act was to set the watch, not to a specific time, but to a steady, unwavering beat, the heartbeat of the present, a rhythm that allowed life to flow, to stutter no more, but to simply be. The Institute for Topographical Anomalies, known by its staff simply as the Gloom, was housed in a brutalist structure on the outskirts of an unnamed, windswept moor. Its sole function was to study the geographical errors, vanishing landmarks, and impossible spaces that occasionally punctured the fabric of conventional reality. Dr. Jonas Alistair, a brilliant but profoundly melancholic cartographer, worked on Project Selene. His task was to chart the lunar shadow, the sliver of land in the world that, during a solar eclipse, did not experience the event. A tiny, anomalous pocket that always remained in full, harsh daylight, no matter the position of the sun or moon. He knew such a place defied orbital mechanics, but satellite data was undeniable. A rotating, erratic patch of ground, roughly the size of a small island, that refused the moon's embrace. Jonas spent years tracking the shadow. His life became a blur of endless coordinates, sterile data, and the oppressive silence of the gloom, which had no windows and was lit entirely by cold, fluorescent tubes that hummed with a sound like caged resentment. One evening, deep in the subterranean archives, he found a leather-bound, unmarked atlas. It was ancient, its pages brittle. It contained not maps of continents, but of feelings. The trench of unspoken guilt, the plateau of pure certainty. On the last page, drawn in silver ink, was a precise map of the world, and across it, moving with impossible accuracy, was the outline of the lunar shadow. Next to it, a single elegant annotation. The shadow is not a void of light. It is a refusal of observation. It is where the universe cannot look. Jonas finally pinpointed the shadow's next appearance, a remote, forgotten valley in the Himalayas. scheduled to receive the full eclipse in 3 days. He loaded his specialized ground-penetrating radar equipment and set out. He arrived at the valley just hours before the eclipse. The surrounding peaks were majestic, but the valley floor was a flat, disturbing expanse of colorless gray dirt. A profound, unsettling stillness hung in the air. As the moon began its slow march across the sun, casting the world into a deepening twilight, Jonas set up his beer. He waited. The eclipse hit the valley with the force of an extinction event. The world went dark, a beautiful, terrifying velvet blackness. The cold air dropped instantly. But right in the center of the valley, just where his coordinates predicted, was the shadow. A perfect circular patch of blinding high-noon light, casting hard, impossibly defined shadows outwards into the gloom. The light was not yellow or white. It was a harsh, crystalline silver that seemed to vibrate. Jonas stepped toward it. As he crossed the threshold, the warmth was immediate and absolute. He looked up. The sky above the shadow was not the eclipse. It was a pale, cloudless blue. The sun was a perfect, ordinary disk. The moon was nowhere in sight. He looked back at the surrounding world. It was a black, silent void, the corona of the eclipse, visible like a ring of ethereal fire around the edges of the shadow. He placed his equipment down. His highly sensitive radar immediately went blank. His camera lens refused to focus, presenting only static white noise. The shadow was not just an absence of darkness, it was an annulment of measurement. As he stared, the ground beneath his feet began to shimmer. The gray dirt wasn't dirt at all. It was a layer of fine metallic dust, and something was moving beneath it. The metallic dust shifted, revealing a structure. A trapdoor made of the same strange, silver-gray material that formed the boundaries of the shadow. Jonas felt an undeniable pull. This was not merely an anomaly, it was a destination. He lifted the trapdoor. Beneath it, a spiral staircase descended into a space that radiated profound cold. He climbed down, leaving the blinding sun of the shadow behind. He found himself in a vast subterranean chamber carved entirely from black, smooth obsidian. It was lit by faint, shifting luminescence that seemed to be trapped in the stone. In the center of the chamber, sitting at a massive, circular table, was a figure. It was skeletal, draped in a heavy charcoal gray robe. Its head was down, bent over a map. The figure slowly raised its head. It had no discernible features, only a surface of smooth black obsidian, save for 2 points of light where eyes should be. 2 tiny, cold, silver pinpricks. "I have waited for the next one," a voice echoed, deep and resonant, yet utterly devoid of inflection. "Who are you?" Jonas whispered, his voice thin in the echoing chamber. "What is this place?" "I am the cartographer of the inner void," the figure replied. "And this is the eye's blind spot, the place where no reality can be fully observed, and therefore no reality can be fully formed." The figure gestured to the map on the table. It was the same map from the ancient atlas, but the shadow was moving across a different region. "I chart the unseen moments," the figure continued. "The thoughts you never articulated, the choices you rejected, the feelings you suppressed. When the universe is distracted by the great spectacle, the eclipse, I bring those unformed moments here to be codified." The figure picked up a small, surgical instrument made of silver, and with impossible precision, etched a new line onto the map. "The shadow is growing," the figure said. "The world is becoming too cluttered with facts, too many observers, too much light. It needs pockets of denial." Jonas looked closer at the map. The areas marked by the shadow were not random. They were places where great historical atrocities or profound collective suppressions had occurred. Jonas felt the cold of the chamber penetrate his core. He looked at the obsidian figure. "Where do you come from?" "From the refusal," the figure said, the silver pinpricks of its eyes fixed on Jonas. "The first man who looked at the truth of his life and chose to see the opposite. He was absorbed by the shadow, becoming the mechanism of its denial." The figure then pointed its obsidian hand at Jonas's heart. "You came here because you too seek the truth that lies in the unseen. You chart what cannot be measured. You are the perfect candidate for the next keeper." Jonas felt a wave of unbearable emptiness wash over him. a profound sense of self-denial he had carried since childhood, suppressing the truth of his own profound, personal failing. He had spent his life charting the Earth's refusal to be observed, because he was practicing his own refusal to be seen. The figure reached out a hand, its obsidian fingers cold and sharp. Your instruments failed, because the shadow demanded a more sensitive tool, your consciousness. You must now become the map. You must hold the location of all the world's self-denials. As the figure spoke, the silver pinpricks in its eyes began to dim, flickering like dying stars. The heavy robe seemed to grow looser, the skeletal frame within becoming smaller. Jonas knew the former keeper was fading, his essence having been entirely consumed by the shadow's duty. He looked up at the trapdoor above him. The silver light of the shadow was still there, beckoning him back to the world of measurement and time. He looked at the obsidian figure. The cartographer of the inner void was now barely a husk, only its silver-edged map remaining clear. Jonas made a choice, not of light or dark, but of acknowledgement. He had sought the shadow to escape his own reflection. Now he would confront it. He stepped back, away from the obsidian figure. He took his high-frequency audio recorder, useless for charting, and placed it on the circular table, right on top of the shadow map. "I won't be the map," Jonas said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I'll be the record. The shadow can exist, but it must be witnessed." He pressed the record button. He spoke, not coordinates, but the truth of his life, his failure, his fear, his suppressed guilt. A raw, complete confession poured into the silver pinpricks of the fading keeper. As his voice washed over the chamber, the obsidian figure convulsed. The silver map on the table began to ripple, distorted by the sound of witnessed truth. The shadow did not want truth. It wanted denial. A deafening, silent pressure hit Jonas. The air was sucked from his lungs. He was being violently rejected by the place he had sought. He was thrown backward, landing hard outside the trapdoor, back in the blinding silver light of the lunar shadow. He scrambled to his feet. The trapdoor vanished instantly, the metallic dust closing over the spot as if nothing had ever been there. Jonas stood alone in the brilliant, silent light, clutching his still-recording audio device. He looked up. The sun was now half-eaten by the moon. The shadow was contracting, shrinking rapidly, its work disturbed. As the eclipse ended and the sun burst back into the world, Jonas was left standing on a barren, gray patch of ordinary ground. He played back the recording. It was just the sound of wind and static, followed by his own confession. But beneath his voice, a high-frequency screech could be heard. The sound of an entity in terrible pain. The sound of the cartographer of the inner void, forced to listen to a truth it was designed to deny. Jonas left the valley, no longer seeking the shadow. He knew it was still out there, hiding in the eclipse, but it was flawed. It held a memory, a sound, a witness, and every time the eclipse fell, the shadow would have to work harder, trying to suppress the single recorded sound of one man's confession. He was no longer a cartographer of anomaly. He was the keeper of the counter-denial, and somewhere in the endless void of the eclipse, the obsidian figure was searching for the one spot on the map where it could finally hide from the sound of its own truth. The city of Viridian was unremarkable, save for one thing, a small, unmarked side street that simply wasn't there most of the time. When it did appear, it contained a single, sprawling sandstone building with no windows and a simple plaque that read, "The Museum of Things That Should Not Be." Dr. Arthur Pendleton was the museum's last curator. He didn't work for a board, he worked for the collection itself. His job was simple: catalog, contain, and ensure that the items never, ever left the premises. The museum was a maze of dusty, interconnected chambers, each lit by a single bare, incandescent bulb that hummed a melancholic, unsteady tune. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled of ozone, rust, and the faint, pervasive scent of unreality. Arthur was currently in the sub-basement, a section reserved for conceptual anomalies. He was working on a small, unassuming jar labeled simply, "The Silence of an Unwritten Poem." The jar contained nothing visible, yet it radiated an intense, focused negation of sound. When Arthur opened the lid to document its containment integrity, he was momentarily deafened, his own thoughts screaming in the sudden internal void. As he sealed the jar, he heard a sound that was far worse than silence. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap coming from the next chamber. That chamber was empty. It was dedicated to a single exhibit that had never arrived, the key to the end of all things. Arthur followed the tap, tap, tap into the next wing, a hall of inverted logic. This was where the physical rules of the universe were stored in fragile, impossible forms. He passed several unsettling exhibits, a perfectly still pendulum that marked the moment gravity failed, a mirror that reflected the future you almost chose, and a vessel of pure contradiction, a glass bowl that was simultaneously full and empty. The tap, tap, tap led him to the museum's largest and most unsettling artifact, the Tapestry of Forgotten People. It was a massive, ancient tapestry, woven from countless threads of varying textures and colors. It depicted no scene, only an infinite, swirling pattern. But if you stared at it long enough, you could make out faces, millions of them, staring back from the weave. These were people who had been entirely erased from history, not by malice, but by the subtle, crushing weight of collective inattention. The tap, tap, tap was coming from the center of the tapestry. Arthur approached the relic, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm that the museum's atmosphere seemed to be trying to damp down. The weave at the center of the tapestry was vibrating. He reached out and gently parted the threads. Inside the tapestry, where the threads should have been solid backing, was a small, localized void, a patch of absolute blackness that seemed to swallow all light and dimension. And sitting right in the center of the void, tapping gently on a piece of smooth black stone, was a small iron key. The key to the end of all things had arrived. Arthur had spent his life studying the theoretical danger of this object. It wasn't a key to a door, it was a key to a concept. The last lock of reality. If turned, it would simply allow the universe to recognize its own inherent illogic and cease to exist. As he stared into the void, the tapestry faces around the edges began to shift, their expressions turning from passive confusion to active pleading. They knew what the key represented. For them, erasure was preferable to non-existence. The key itself was unremarkable, cold and solid. As Arthur reached for it, the voice of the tapestry whispered, soft and dry like old leaves rustling, "Take it, curator. End the watch. We are tired of being the shadows of others' lives." But Arthur hesitated. The museum was necessary. The containment of anomalies was the only thing preventing reality from collapsing into itself. He pulled back his hand and picked up his logbook. As he opened it to document the key's arrival, he saw that the last entry, dated 2 weeks ago, was not his. Entry 782, the curator is losing focus. The collection demands a pure observer. The final component must be prepared. Arthur realized the truth. The key had been in the museum for weeks. It had been waiting in the empty chamber, and the final component was him. His growing fatigue, his loss of focus, it was the collection preparing him to be the lock that the key would turn. He looked at the tapestry again. He saw his own face, faint and translucent, woven into the shifting background, already becoming one of the forgotten. The tapestry figures were pleading more urgently now, their woven faces contorted. He knew that the longer he waited, the more he became part of the exhibit, the weaker his will would be. Arthur ran from the tapestry, back through the hall of inverted logic, toward the one place in the museum that offered true containment, the chamber of absolute nullification. This chamber contained a highly complex, rotating magnetic field designed to neutralize all conceptual energy, effectively neutralizing a paradox by forcing it to be perfectly balanced. He burst into the chamber. It was lined with humming copper coils. In the center was the platform, empty and ready. Arthur looked down at his hand. The faint, metallic dust of unreality was gathering on his skin. He was already beginning to fade from this reality, drawn into the tapestry. He turned and saw the key. It was no longer in the tapestry. It was sitting on the floor behind him, having followed him through the museum. The tap, tap, tap started again, slow and rhythmic. He knew he couldn't simply destroy the key. A paradox cannot be destroyed, only contained. He reached
down and picked up the key.
It was icy cold and pulsed with a faint internal heat, a perfect chilling contradiction.
As he held it, the final instruction, the purpose of the museum, flooded his mind. Contain the paradox by becoming the paradox. Arthur walked to the center of the nullification chamber and activated the coils. The air screamed as the complex magnetic field snapped to life, the copper humming violently. He looked at the key. It was the endpoint of all things. He looked at the magnetic field. It was the point of absolute balance. To contain the key, he couldn't put it in a box. He had to make it irrelevant. With a final act of pure will, Arthur pressed the key, the end of all things, against his own chest, the place where his heart, the symbol of finite life, beat its final desperate rhythm. The result was not an explosion. It was a profound, absolute silence, far deeper than the unwritten poem. The museum of things that should not be went dark. The humming of the lights ceased. The air became utterly still. When the power eventually returned, the lights flickered back on. The chamber of absolute nullification was intact. The copper coils spun gently. In the center of the platform, however, there was no Arthur, no key, no singularity. There was only a single, heavy sandstone pedestal that had not been there before. And on the pedestal sat a new exhibit, glowing with a soft internal luminescence. It was a paradox so perfectly balanced it was utterly invisible. Yet it occupied physical space and radiated a calm, steady aura of perfect certainty. The plaque on the pedestal read, "The Curator's Paradox," the single object that contains the key to the end of all things, and therefore contains the key to the continuation of all things. It is the final lock and the ultimate key. The museum was safe. The collection was contained.
And outside, on the non-existent street in the unremarkable town of Viridian,
a small obsidian-eyed figure, wearing a gray suit and holding an empty, dusty logbook, began its slow, deliberate walk toward the museum, ready to take up the permanent, silent mantle of the new curator.
The town of Weaver's Knot was built around the loom works, a massive pre-industrial textile factory that never seemed to age. Its brickwork was perpetually damp, and the air around it thrummed with the ceaseless, mechanical rhythm of ancient machinery. Locals whispered that the loom works didn't produce cloth, it wove possibilities. Elias Vane, a historian specializing in industrial archaeology, arrived in Weaver's Knot to document the factory before its rumored demolition. He was less interested in the textiles and more intrigued by the bizarre local superstition. The factory had no entrance or exit. The workers simply appeared inside at dawn and vanished at dusk. He approached the loomworks, its walls seamless and cold. The sound was deafening, a relentless clack, clack, clack of looms running at impossible speed. He ran his hand over the brick wall, searching for an entryway. As his fingers brushed a damp section of mortar, the sound intensified and the wall shimmered, folding in on itself like a heavy curtain. He stepped through, and the wall sealed shut behind him with a wet, final sound. The air inside was hot, thick with the scent of ozone, steam, and something acridly metallic. The factory floor was cavernous, filled with hundreds of immense, cast-iron looms, all running at a furious pace. The workers were unnerving. They were dressed in uniform, colorless overalls, their faces pale and vacant. They moved with mechanical precision, tending the rapidly weaving threads. They never looked up, never spoke, and never seemed to notice Elias. He noticed that the threads they were weaving were not cotton or wool. They were thin, shimmering filaments of light, moving so fast they were almost invisible. The air was heavy with these crisscrossing threads of possibility. Elias walked the narrow aisles, ducking under the humming crossbeams. The rhythm of the looms wasn't random. It followed a complex, mesmerizing pattern, a beat that seemed to accelerate and stutter based on an unseen cue. He reached the central area, where a single, immense master loom dominated the floor. It was a cathedral of black iron, its moving parts polished to a mirror sheen. This loom was weaving a single, enormous, colorless tapestry, rolling it up onto a massive brass cylinder. He watched the tapestry closely. It seemed to be woven from threads of pure darkness and pure light. As he stared, he realized the pattern was not abstract. It was a depiction of a vast, sprawling city, a metropolis he had never seen, but which felt profoundly familiar. Suddenly, the image shifted. The city was consumed by fire, and the entire section of the tapestry turned a frantic, shimmering red. Then, the image reversed. The fire vanished, the section turned a calm, deep blue, and the city was shown rebuilding, taller and stronger. The master loom was weaving the future. Not one future, but the probability cascade of the entire world, charting every potential rise and fall, success and failure. Elias gasped, stumbling backward. A worker, moving with inhuman speed, stepped into his path. The worker had no features, only a smooth, pale mask where a face should be. It raised a hand, thin and metallic, and pointed at Elias's chest. A soft voice, devoid of emotion, echoed from the mask. You are an observer. Observers are friction. Friction disrupts the weave. The worker moved on, resuming its mechanical duty, leaving Elias chilled and breathless. Elias continued deeper, drawn by a cold draft. He found a descending stairwell, hidden behind a cascade of falling threads. He went down into the sub-basement. The heat and sound of the looms faded, replaced by a profound icy silence and a terrible rhythmic snapping sound, like dry wood breaking. This subterranean chamber contained only one machine, the Unraveler. It was a small, delicate loom, made of bone-white ceramic and silver. It was completely silent, yet it was furiously active. Instead of weaving, it was undoing threads. It was slowly, meticulously pulling apart the tapestry of possibilities woven by the master loom above. The threads fed into the Unraveler were not bright. They were muted, dull gray filaments. And as the machine unwove them, the threads did not fall to the floor. They simply vanished into the air, leaving behind an increasing sense of emptiness. Beside the Unraveler sat another figure, the Keeper. This one was a woman, ancient and frail, dressed in rags woven from the same colorless material as the workers' overalls. Her eyes were milky white, and her fingers, raw and bleeding, worked with a furious speed, guiding the threads into the mechanism. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice shaking. The Keeper did not look up. Her voice was thin, dry, and brittle, like the sound of the snapping threads. "I am the one who finds the flaws, the contradictions, the moments that should never have been woven." She pointed to the threads she was feeding the Unraveler. "These are threads of regret, moments of cruelty, moments of absolute failure. If they remain in the great tapestry, the entire future will rot with contradiction. I must pull them out." As she spoke, one of the gray threads she was handling suddenly flared with a clear, agonizing sound, the sound of a desperate plea for help. The sound was instantly silenced as the thread was yanked into the Unraveler. "Every thread contains a life," the Keeper whispered. "A possibility. And I must kill it. I must unbe them." Elias watched in horror as the Keeper ruthlessly fed threads into the Unraveler. He realized the workers above weren't weaving the future. They were weaving all futures, the good and the terrible. And the Keeper, the Unraveler, was the grim editor, ensuring the resulting tapestry wasn't so horrible that reality tore itself apart. Suddenly, the master loom above changed its rhythm. The floor above thrummed with a frantic, accelerating clack, clack, clack. A new thread, thicker and darker than any Elias had seen, dropped down through a small aperture near the Unraveler. It was a thread of pure, shimmering blackness. The Keeper gasped, her milky eyes widening in terror. "No, not that thread, it is too vital." She tried to push it away, but the thread was alive, coiling around her frail fingers. Elias recognized the sensation emanating from the black thread. It was the weight of a single, irreversible choice, a massive global failure that could not be reversed or absorbed. The thread snapped free from the Keeper's grasp and raced toward the Unraveler. "It will unravel the tapestry," the Keeper shrieked. "It will unbe everything. This is the thread that holds all the others in place." Elias knew he couldn't let it happen. He lunged forward, grabbing the thick, dark thread just as it was about to be pulled into the ceramic jaws of the unraveler. The moment his skin touched the thread, a billion realities flooded his mind. Every war, every plague, every moment of human sorrow and cruelty, all contained within that single pulsing filament. He fought the urge to let go, the urge to let the world erase its pain. But he saw the truth. Without the flaws, without the darkness, the light had no definition. He yanked the thread hard, pulling it free from the unraveler's mechanism. The machine screamed, a high, whining sound of mechanical protest. The dark thread, now free, whipped violently, slamming against the bone-white ceramic of the unraveler. The little loom shattered instantly, exploding into a cloud of fine, crystalline dust. The thousands of gray threads still waiting to be unraveled immediately dissolved into nothingness. Silence fell, absolute and crushing, deeper than the silence of the black moss in Blackwood Creek. Elias looked at the keeper. She was staring at her hands, which were now perfectly still and smooth, free of cuts and blood. Her milky eyes were clear, bright, and filled with a terrifying blank wonder. "You saved the regret," she whispered, her voice no longer brittle, but young and strong. "You chose the flaw." She stood up, her rags falling away to reveal the colorless, perfect uniform of a worker. She was no longer old or frail. She was pale, featureless, and whole. "Now," she said, her voice echoing with the mechanical rhythm of the master loom above, "I am free from the editing, and you must take my place." She pointed to the master loom, where the vast colorless tapestry of the future was still being woven. The black thread, the thread of irreversible choice, was now coiling around Elias's wrist, fusing itself to his skin. He was the new keeper. He was the one who had to find the replacement for the unraveler, or else the relentless weaving above would continue, unchecked, covering the world in a beautiful, terrible tapestry of every single possible, unedited future. Elias looked at his wrist, the black thread now part of him. He was permanently tethered to the world's greatest flaw, and above him, the clack-clack-clack of the master loom continued, weaving his own inevitable, unedited future into the vast, silent fabric of reality. The St. Jude Terminal Ward was not an institution designed for healing, it was designed for concluding. It was built on the highest point of an isolated hill, visible from miles away, yet inexplicably difficult to reach. Its architecture was stark and imposing, gray concrete, minimal windows, and a silence that felt less like peace and more like a vacuum. Dr. Eris Cole arrived at St. Jude not as a patient, but as a specialist brought in to investigate the hospital's bizarre financial records. The records showed a steady, consistent occupancy of 33 patients for the last 70 years, with 0 discharges, 0 transfers, and 0 deaths officially recorded in public ledgers. He met the head of the facility, a tall, gaunt man named Chief Administrator Cale. Cale's smile was thin and cold, and his eyes held the weary neutrality of someone who had seen every possible variation of an ending. "Welcome, Dr. Cole," Cale said, leading him down a perpetually dimmed corridor. "We are a facility dedicated to sustaining the final stages. Our focus is on profound, uninterrupted observation." The corridors were lined with numbered doors, all uniform and unmarked. The air was sterile, yet carried a faint, sweet, metallic scent, like old copper and lilies. As they walked, Eris heard the sound of a soft, rhythmic humming coming from behind the doors. Not music, but a low, continuous vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Cale stopped before a room marked 13. "Here we have Mr. Alistair. He has been with us since 1955. Observe." Cale slid open a small, opaque panel in the door. Inside, a man lay in a spotless white bed. He was ancient, his face smooth and unnaturally preserved, like polished stone. He was breathing slow, shallow breaths, his eyes closed. He looked impossibly still, suspended between life and death. "He requires nothing but the attention of the ward," Cale whispered. "He is sustained by the stasis of anticipation." Eris spent 3 days reviewing the hospital's operational logs. The numbers defied logic. The 33 patients consumed virtually no resources, no food, minimal medication, and no specialized care. The expenses were entirely devoted to maintenance of the building and the continuous low-level power draw for the patient sustenance grid.
He managed to slip away from Kale and accessed a restricted maintenance shaft leading to the sub-basement. The humming he had heard upstairs was deafening down here. The sub-basement was a vast, circular chamber filled with massive antique machinery, brass coils, copper conduits, and heavy, spinning flywheels. It looked more like a 19th century power plant than a modern hospital system. In the center of the chamber, beneath a massive, glowing glass dome, was the core of the sustenance grid, a single, colossal, perfectly polished brass mechanism that rotated slowly. It resembled a gigantic, ornate clockwork heart, pumping not blood, but time. And connected to this heart were 33 individual, shimmering filaments of light, each leading up through the ceiling toward the numbered rooms above. Eris followed the filaments up the shaft, realizing they were connected directly to the patients. The sustenance grid wasn't keeping them alive, it was keeping their ending indefinitely on hold. He crept back upstairs, finding an observation station near room 13. He put his ear against the thin wall and heard the low, rhythmic humming intensify. Then, a single, clear whisper cut through the noise. "Almost. The end is almost here." It was the patient, Mr. Alistair, speaking in a thin, reedy voice. Eris peered through the viewing port. The patient was still motionless, eyes closed. Then, he noticed something horrifying. The patient's lips weren't moving. The whisper was emanating from a small, crystalline capsule lodged in the patient's left hand, connected to the luminous filament. The capsule contained a single, clear tear. Eris realized the patients were not victims. They were participants in a profound, terrible process. They were the curated ends, individuals whose lives had reached a point of ultimate emotional or intellectual finality, and who had been brought here to have that ending sustained, observed, and perfected. He cornered a nurse, a woman whose face was perpetually obscured by shadows and whose movements were unnaturally smooth. "What is the sustenance grid?" Eris demanded. "What are those filaments?" The nurse spoke, her voice calm and unsettling. "The grid is the collector. The patients here have reached the apex of their narrative arc, the moment of complete, total surrender. That moment is a profound release of energy, a singular truth. The grid captures that truth." She continued, her eyes widening slightly. "It maintains the patient at that threshold, perpetually observing the fraction of a second before the surrender. That sustained moment is the ward's purpose. And the humming? That is the collective anticipation. The sound of 33 lives waiting for the final, ultimate moment to be perfected." Eris was led to the hospital's main archive room, where Kale was waiting. The room was not filled with patient files, but with thousands of leather-bound journals. "This is our true purpose, Dr. Cole," Kale said, gesturing to the shelves. "We are the archivists of finality. Each patient's sustained ending is documented here, their final truth captured, distilled, and held in perpetual observation." Kale pulled down a large antique journal. The pages were blank, save for a single ornate drawing of the brass clockwork mechanism in the basement. "The ultimate end," Kale whispered, "is the perfect blank slate. The greatest truth is the acceptance of nothingness. The grid sustains the patients until their final, perfect truth is ready to be cataloged and integrated into the mechanism itself." He pointed to an empty space in the drawing, a space shaped exactly like the crystalline capsule in the patient's hand. Eris looked at Kale. "Why are you showing me this? I was supposed to be auditing your finances." Kale's cold smile returned, wider this time. "The financial records are irrelevant. They are a necessary lie for the outside world. You, Dr. Cole, were brought here not to audit, but to conclude." Kale stepped back, revealing a single, pristine white bed in the corner of the archive room. It was identical to the beds upstairs, and next to it, on a small table, sat a polished brass plaque. The plaque read, "Patient 34, Dr. Eris Cole, final stage, acceptance of the anomaly. We have been observing your life, Doctor," Kale said softly. "The moment you chose to investigate St. Jude, the moment you decided that the unexplainable was a challenge, not a fear, you initiated your final stage. Your narrative arc is complete. You are the perfect candidate for the next curator's admission." Eris felt the humid air thicken. The humming from the basement intensified, vibrating through the floorboards and into his bones. He suddenly felt a profound, exhausting weariness.
the cumulative weight of his life's efforts and failures settling upon him. He looked at the bed, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the appeal, the chance to simply stop, to rest at the perfect sustained threshold, observed, archived, and free of the chaotic flow of time. "No," Eris managed to choke out. "I won't conclude. I won't surrender." Cale shook his head, a pitying expression on his face. "Resistance is merely a delay, Doctor. The grid is already drawing your conclusion." Eris backed away, his eyes fixed on the bed. He felt the cold touch of the sustenance grid pulling at his will. He looked down at his hand, and he saw a faint, shimmering filament of light already attaching itself to his wrist. In a desperate, final act, he grabbed the antique journal from Cale's desk. He didn't open it. He jammed the heavy, brass-edged cover into the spinning clockwork mechanism in the center of the sub-basement. The colossal clockwork heart of the sustenance grid screamed, a grinding, metallic sound of agonizing interruption. The 33 filaments of light snapped, dissolving instantly. A profound, absolute silence fell upon St. Jude. Upstairs, the patients in the 33 rooms began to stir. Eris looked at Cale. The administrator's face was contorted in a silent scream of pure anguish. "You have shattered the stasis," Cale choked out, his voice now weak and human. "The ends will happen now, all at once." Eris didn't wait. He ran. He ran back out through the long, silent corridors and out the main doors. As he drove away, he looked back at St. Jude. The building was shrouded in a sudden, thick, unnatural fog. He didn't see fire or collapse, but he heard 33 simultaneous, perfectly timed, profound sighs, the sound of 33 lives finally reaching their earned conclusion. He sped down the hill, away from the facility that would now face the terrible chaos of real time. But as he looked down at his hand, he saw a single, clear tear well up in his eye. It was cold, clean, and perfectly formed. He knew he hadn't escaped the ward entirely. He was still carrying the conclusion. He had simply become the 34th capsule, the uncontained anomaly of St. Jude, free to walk the world, carrying the single, perfect, and terrifying moment of his own conclusion, waiting for the day it would finally dry. The town of Stillwater Springs was unique for its pervasive, deeply unsettling quality. There were no mirrors. Every reflective surface had been coated, painted over, or shattered. Windows were made of rough, frosted glass. Even the town's namesake spring was lined with opaque ceramic tiles. The people of Stillwater Springs lived in a world where their own images were forbidden. Simon Kessler, an art restorer specializing in Renaissance portraiture, arrived under contract to authenticate a rumored cache of forgotten old masters' paintings. He found the town oppressive. The constant lack of reflection felt like a physical weight, forcing him to rely solely on the perceptions of others. The rumored cache was found beneath the town hall, in a subterranean vault that smelled strongly of varnish and dried blood. It was a collection of hundreds of portraits, spanning centuries of style, yet all shared one bizarre feature. They were unfinished. Every subject was perfectly rendered save for the eyes. In every single painting, the eyes were left blank, smooth, pale patches of untouched canvas. Simon began his cataloging, meticulously cleaning and restoring the works. He soon realized that the style wasn't the only thing that changed over the centuries. The nature of the unfinished eyes evolved. The oldest portraits had eyes that were merely blank ovals. The newer portraits, however, had eyes that looked like shallow, dusty wells, radiating an unnerving sense of anticipation. Simon spoke to the current caretaker of the vault, an elderly woman named Martha, whose own eyes held a distant, weary look. "Why are the eyes always blank, Martha?" he asked one cold afternoon, holding up a magnificent 17th century portrait of a stern-faced merchant. Martha didn't look at the painting. "The people of Stillwater Springs gave them up," she whispered, her voice dry as parchment. "A long time ago, they believed that to see oneself was to invite the watcher in. We gave our sight to the portraits so the watcher would never know where to look." She explained the town's history, a pact made generations ago to avoid an entity that thrived on self-awareness. By giving up reflection, they became invisible to it. By leaving the portraits unfinished, they offered a place for the watcher to look, but denied it the final connection, the gaze. Simon was skeptical,
but the uniformity of the blank eyes across 500 years of artwork was undeniable. As he worked late that night, alone in the vault, he heard a sound, a soft, unsettling shuffling, like velvet on stone, coming from the rows of stacked portraits. He shone his light toward the sound. A portrait of a young woman, leaning against the wall, seemed to be vibrating faintly. He approached it. The blank eyes were darker than before, looking less like wells and more like shallow pools of stagnant water. He heard a faint, desperate whisper emanating from the portrait. "Help me finish. I can't leave until I see." He immediately backed away. The shuffling stopped. The eyes returned to dusty blanks. He realized the unfinished portraits were not merely paintings. They were shells. Shells waiting for their subjects to be finally rendered, waiting for their sight to be returned. And the subjects were trapped in the perpetual limbo of the watcher's gaze, held by the blankness of their own images. Simon found the oldest object in the vault, a small dark wooden box, intricately carved. He opened it. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a single vial of paint. The pigment was a deep, glossy black, unlike any color he had ever seen. It seemed to absorb the light, leaving behind a subtle, shifting sheen. An accompanying note, written in archaic script, explained, "The final pigment. Not paint, but the condensed essence of sight. Use only when the pact is broken." To finish a portrait is to call the watcher forth, but it is also to free the subject into their final, earned truth. Simon understood. The townspeople hadn't destroyed the mirrors because of fear. They had destroyed them to keep the pact intact. If any living soul in Stillwater Springs saw their own reflection, the watcher would know they were being observed, and the protection would fail. He looked at the portraits, hundreds of frozen lives waiting for release. He looked at the vial of the final pigment. He decided to complete one, to understand the stakes. He chose the newest portrait, a vivid image of a girl from the 1920s, her expression a mix of youthful defiance and fear. He set the canvas on his easel. He opened the vial of black pigment. The air immediately grew cold, and the subtle sheen of the paint seemed to reach out, absorbing the electric light of the vault. He picked up his finest brush. As the bristles dipped into the black, glossy substance, the girl's portrait began to hum with a low, vibrant energy. He brought the brush to the canvas. As the first tiny dot of black paint touched the pale canvas of the left eye, a high-pitched, silent scream filled the vault, vibrating in the bones. The girl's eye was instantly complete. It was a flawless, terrifying black, deep and glossy, and it stared, not at him, but with perfect self-awareness, straight into the vault. The moment the first eye was finished, the silence of the town above shattered. A cacophony of panicked shouts echoed down the steps, quickly followed by the distinct sound of shattering glass. The town's pact was broken. Simon worked feverishly, painting the second eye. As the final dot of black pigment was placed, the girl in the portrait seemed to draw a deep, shuddering breath. Her painted lips parted and she spoke, her voice clear and sorrowful. "Thank you. Now I see." The painting was finished. The subject was complete, but the consequence was immediate. The completed eyes, now fully aware, focused intently on the wall behind Simon. The air grew icy, and the light bulb above sputtered and died. Simon turned. The walls of the vault, made of rough, ancient stone, began to shimmer, and etched into the stone, appearing slowly like developing film, was a massive, shifting image, a silent, geometric eye, composed of swirling shadow and absolute light. The watcher had arrived. It was looking, finally, not at a mirror, but at the place where a completed self existed. The portraits around the room began to stir. The unfinished eyes, the dusty wells, stared frantically at the completed portrait, absorbing the final terrifying truth of sight. The watcher's image grew larger, its geometric lines sharp and cold. It was staring directly into the finished eyes of the young woman. The self is seen. The watcher's presence echoed in Simon's mind. A cold, dry thought. The pact is void. All reflections are mine. Simon knew he had to destroy the completed portrait, but as he moved, his hand brushed his own cheek. He glanced at the glass vial of the remaining final pigment, still sitting on the easel. He didn't see his face in the vial. He saw the watcher's reflection. The vial was polished glass, and now that the pact was broken, every surface capable of reflection was doing its duty. The watcher's geometric eye focused on the vial.
a tiny, perfect reflection of its own presence. Simon screamed, grabbing the vial. He didn't smash it. Instead, he slammed his own face down onto the easel, deliberately grinding the remaining black pigment into his own eyes. The final, total silence returned. The vault went absolutely black. When the light eventually flickered back on, a dim, weak red glow, the vault was empty. The completed portrait was gone. The hundreds of unfinished portraits remained, their blank eyes fixed on the ceiling. And standing in the center of the vault was a new, strange figure. A man whose eyes were covered by two perfect, glossy circles of pitch-black pigment. Simon, the unseeing curator. He ran his hand over the dusty surface of the easel. He could no longer see, but he could sense the absence of the completed painting. He had freed the girl and trapped the watcher in the ultimate paradox, a presence that feeds on reflection, now observed by eyes that can never see it, because they are no longer mirrors, but pure, absolute absorbers of light. The watcher's image had vanished. The town was silent again. The new curator, his face a chilling mask of final, absolute darkness, picked up a clean logbook. His first entry, written in perfect, steady script, would be the description of the only thing left, the deep, pervasive cold of the site he had sacrificed. The Institute of Absolute Geography was built not to chart the world as it was, but as it should be. Hidden in the heart of a vast, sterile desert, the Institute's researchers were dedicated to finding and correcting geographical deviations, areas where local reality failed to conform to theoretical perfection. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a brilliant but deeply cynical geographer, worked on the most restricted project, the Atlas Obscura. This was a collection of maps that refused to conform, maps that stubbornly depicted non-existent rivers, vanished towns, and impossible mountain ranges. His current fixation was Map 41, an ordinary-looking sheet of vellum that depicted a network of small, twisting roads and a single, isolated manor deep within a protected national forest. A forest that, according to satellite imaging and federal records, contained no roads and no buildings whatsoever. The disturbing quality of Map 41 was its actuality. When Arthur placed his hand on the paper, he could feel the faint, cold texture of rough-cut asphalt and the damp chill of old stone. The map felt more real than the desk it rested on. One cold night, while running a carbon dating test on the vellum, the lights in the lab flickered and died. A thick, unsettling silence descended, far deeper than the typical quiet of the desert. In the sudden darkness, Arthur heard a faint sound emanating from Map 41, the distant rattle of a broken gate, followed by the crunch of heavy tires on gravel. He fumbled for his emergency lantern. When the beam hit the map, the lines glowed with a faint internal light, and the silence was instantly replaced by the muffled, rhythmic sound of a hammer hitting wood. Driven by an irresistible compulsion, Arthur took the map and left the Institute. Following the luminous lines of Map 41, he drove hours into the national forest, past countless no trespassing signs and deep into the unlogged wilderness. The GPS on his phone failed immediately, replaced by a looping static scream. Yet he never felt lost. The map in his hand pulsed, guiding him with an undeniable certainty. After hours of driving on logging roads, the map led him to a narrow, overgrown dirt track, a road that should not exist. He turned onto it. He drove for a mile until the map's drawn line led him to a rusted iron gate, broken and listing, the source of the rattling sound he had heard. He pushed it open, and the crunch of his tires on the moss-covered gravel matched the sound he had heard hours ago. The road wound through dense, skeletal trees until the forest abruptly gave way to a massive, perfectly manicured lawn. In the center stood the Amnesiac Manor, a sprawling, dark Victorian house built of black, unpolished stone. It looked exactly as it did on Map 41. The front door was open, revealing a deep, shadowy interior. A profound silence hung over the manor and the manicured grounds. A silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a space actively listening. He stepped inside. The foyer was vast, smelling of old dust, cedar, and something faintly sweet, like ancient dried flowers. The floor was laid with black and white marble tiles, arranged in a dizzying spectrum, complex geometric pattern that seemed to shimmer as he looked at it. He heard the hammering again, closer this time, coming from the upper floors. He ascended the massive, curving staircase, guided by the sound. He found himself in a hallway lined with closed, wooden doors, all identical. The hammering was behind the last door on the left. Arthur pushed the door open. The room was bare, save for two things: a single, heavy wooden coffin resting on the floor, and a man kneeling beside it. The man was old, dressed in the formal, outmoded attire of a 19th century architect. He was meticulously hammering small, brass plates into the lid of the coffin, sealing it shut. The coffin's surface was lined with hundreds of these tiny, inscribed plates. "You're late," the old man said, not looking up.
His voice was dry and papery. "The final measurements must be taken before the next shift."
"Who are you? What is this place?" Arthur demanded, clutching the map.
The old man finally looked up. His eyes were wide and milky, like the surface of the sea on a moonless night. "I am the architect of failure," he stated, picking up his hammer. "And this is the manor of the unchosen. Every map must be perfect, Dr. Pendleton. Every reality must be absolute." He pointed to the coffin. "This contains the physical reality of this manor. The roads, the forest, the very air. This place exists only to house every minute accidental geographical imperfection that threatened to break the perfection of the world outside." He explained that the Institute of Absolute Geography, in its quest for perfect reality, needed a place to deposit every error, every structural failure, every place that simply refused to conform to the dominant map. "And the map?" Arthur asked, looking at map 41. "The map is the blueprint of the rejected. It is the absolute, irrefutable truth of this place. That is why it feels real, Doctor. It is real. But it is a reality that must be contained here, sealed away from the rest of the world." The old man finished hammering the last brass plate. It was inscribed with the precise coordinates of the manor. "Each plate contains a corrected flaw," the architect said, tapping the coffin lid. "A river that dried up prematurely, a mountain that failed to rise, a village that was never founded. All the world's geological failures are buried here. And the silence? The silence is the suppression. We must not allow the sound of failure to leak out and contaminate the reality of success." The architect of failure rose, his joints cracking like dry wood. He approached Arthur, his milky eyes fixed on map 41. "The time for the shift is upon us, Doctor," the architect whispered. "The world requires its next map. The Institute requires its next surveyor." He pointed to an empty space on the coffin lid. "There is one final flaw that must be sealed away: the existence of map 41 itself. It is the ultimate contradiction, a blueprint of non-existence." Arthur realized the horrible truth. Map 41 could not simply be destroyed. It had to be contained, rendered inert by being made physically real within the manor of the unchosen. The architect reached out a bony hand. "You carried the map here, Doctor. You made it real. Now you must transfer its truth." Arthur looked down at the map, then at the coffin. The map pulsed, warm and alive in his hands. He knew if he surrendered the map, he would be doing the Institute's bidding, sealing away a truth just because it was inconvenient. He didn't hand over the map. Instead, he dropped map 41 onto the marble floor. He then picked up the architect's hammer and surgical inscribing tool. He walked to the empty space on the coffin lid. "I won't bury the map," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent room. "I will bury the keeper." With deliberate, shaky hands, he began to inscribe the final brass plate, not with the map's details, but with the precise coordinates of the Institute of Absolute Geography, along with the name of its director, and the exact coordinates of the room where the Atlas Obscura was housed. The architect screamed, a dry, ripping sound that was instantly absorbed by the heavy air of the manor. "No, that is not a flaw. That is the center of truth." "No," Arthur countered, furiously inscribing the director's name. "The attempt to impose absolute perfection is the greatest flaw of all." He finished the inscription and hammered the final brass plate into the coffin lid. The moment the final nail was struck, the entire manor of the unchosen convulsed. The silence shattered, replaced by a deep, resonant humming that spoke of massive gears shifting. The walls began to crack,
The floor tiles lifted, and the coffin, now sealed with its shocking new truth, began to sink slowly into the marble floor. The architect of failure shrieked, running toward the sinking coffin, trying to pull the final plate off. Arthur fled the room, racing down the stairs and out of the manor. He didn't look back. He drove the jeep down the twisting road, back through the rusting gate. As he hit the main logging road, the surrounding trees blurred, and his GPS snapped back to life, showing his location hundreds of miles from any known road, smack in the middle of a dense, unlogged national forest. He was safe. The manor of the Unchosen was gone, but as he looked at his GPS screen, he noticed one horrifying detail. The coordinates of his current location, a spot where there should have been only trees, now showed a single small, circular icon. And the name of the icon, the Manor of the Unchosen. The manor was no longer a sealed, distant flaw. By burying the truth of the Institute within the coffin, Arthur had shattered the containment. He had made the flaw mobile. He was now driving the world's most chaotic geographical anomaly. The manor would appear wherever a lie was told, wherever a truth was suppressed, forever following the path of those who sought to draw perfect lines over an imperfect world. And the first place it would likely appear was the Institute of Absolute Geography itself, ready to absorb its largest failure. The city of vapor existed in a perpetual haze, not of smoke or mist, but of a constant shifting perfume, a heady, overwhelming mix of every scent ever released within its ancient walls. Deep beneath vapor lay the Museum of Olfactory Memory, a sprawling, chilled vault dedicated to the preservation of forgotten smells. Professor Dr. Silas Vane, a chemist obsessed with the non-visual record of history, was the museum's last curator. Silas's current project involved cataloging the essences of non-existence, scents that were documented but never actually produced, or those that had been violently removed from the timeline. The museum was a claustrophobic maze of pressurized vaults, cooled far below freezing. The air was thin, tasting of sterile metal and absolute stillness. In the center of the main hall stood the Amnesiac Archive, a complex, humming machine composed of countless glass tubes and vacuum chambers. It was designed to contain the most volatile scent in the collection, the aroma of absolute emptiness. One frigid night, as Silas was calibrating the archive, he noticed a minute leak. A faint, sweet scent, like burnt sugar and dried lilies, wafted from a sealed containment vault, marked simply, "The Last Breath." He knew that scent. It was the scent of his mother's perfume, the one she wore the night she vanished 20 years ago. Silas opened the maintenance panel on the containment vault. Inside, suspended in a column of freezing liquid nitrogen, was a single, perfect sphere of solid ice. The sweet, sickeningly familiar scent was emanating from the ice itself. He consulted the digital ledger. The vault log recorded only one entry, Object 404, Essential Residue. Date of collection, September 12th, 1999, the day his mother vanished. He realized the museum hadn't just collected a scent. It had collected the last scent of a person's existence before their memory was consumed by time. He touched the cold glass, and a wave of profound sensory memory washed over him. The sound of a closing door, the cold rush of night air, and his mother's distant voice calling his name, all perfectly reconstructed and triggered by the specific olfactory trace. Suddenly, the Amnesiac Archive across the hall began to hum violently. The machine's vacuum chambers whined, and the scent of emptiness, the acrid, sterilizing smell of non-existence, began to leak into the vault, fighting with the sweet scent of the perfume. The scent of emptiness was winning. As it mixed with the perfume, the familiar, comforting scent began to sour, to thin, to fade. Silas knew that if the scent of his mother was consumed by the emptiness, her entire memory, her trace in the world, would be irrevocably lost, not just to him, but to history itself. A frantic tapping noise echoed from the far end of the vault. Silas rushed over. Behind a thick glass divider was the preservation lab, filled with antique copper stills and pressure gauges. A figure was working inside, a gaunt, elderly woman dressed in the stark white uniform of a former museum technician. She held a long glass pipette, its tip filled with a shimmering, volatile liquid. "Who are you?" Silas demanded,
banging on the glass. The woman turned, her eyes wide, staring at him but not seeing him. "I am the scent thief," she whispered, her voice dry and papery. "I must ensure the purity of the emptiness." She pointed the pipette at the ice sphere in the containment vault. "That sentimental residue is a flaw. It is a thread that tethers a memory to the world. The archive requires absolute negation. I must cleanse the collection." Silas realized the sweet scent of his mother's perfume wasn't merely a remnant. It was a vulnerability. It was the reason her memory had survived 20 years of the archive's influence. A scent thief moved with unnatural speed, running toward the vault containing the ice sphere. Silas grabbed a pressurized tank of pure liquid oxygen, a substance highly reactive to the olfactory emptiness. He shattered the glass divider and threw the tank at the amnesiac archive. The impact caused a catastrophic system failure. The archive screamed, a grinding, mechanical shriek, and the vacuum chambers imploded, releasing a massive plume of the acrid scent of emptiness. The plume didn't dissipate, it coiled, moving purposefully toward the ice sphere, seeking to consume the last trace of the perfume. Silas knew he had moments before the scent was gone forever. He grabbed the scent thief's pipette, the only instrument precise enough to extract the scent without destroying the ice sphere. He thrust the pipette into the containment vault, fighting the intense cold and the suffocating scent of emptiness. He touched the tip of the pipette to the ice sphere. The sphere resisted, its familiar, sweet scent suddenly intensifying, flooding the room and briefly overwhelming the emptiness. The scent thief lunged at him, her eyes now gleaming with frantic desperation. "No, you taint the nothingness. You cannot save the flaw." Silas pulled the pipette back. He had captured a single, minute drop of the volatile, scented liquid. He had the last breath. The scent thief smiled, a terrifying, final expression of triumph. Now it is portable. Now it is vulnerable. She slammed her body against the ice sphere's containment glass. The sphere shattered. The last breath was gone, vaporized instantly by the ambient emptiness. The memory was erased. But Silas looked at the drop in his pipette. He still had the essence. The scent thief looked at him, her triumph fading to horror as she realized her failure. She turned toward the plume of emptiness, which was coiling and shrinking, having completed its function. "You failed," Silas whispered, looking at the captured drop. "But you were right. I cannot let the scent exist in the world unprotected." With a deep, shuddering breath, Silas Vane brought the pipette to his lips. He swallowed the single sweet drop of concentrated perfume. The effect was immediate and total. His vision tunneled. The sterile cold of the vault became a warm, dark room. He smelled not the ozone in metal, but the overwhelming scent of burnt sugar, dried lilies, and the fragrant impossibility of a love lost but not forgotten. Silas Vane was gone. He was no longer a scientist or a curator. He was a sentient archive. The last breath of his mother was now contained within him, protected by his very being. The scent thief, seeing the containment completed, smiled one last time, turned, and walked into the dissipating plume of emptiness, satisfied. Hours later, the emergency teams from Vapor found the museum. The amnesiac archive was a wreck, the ice sphere shattered. They found a man, Dr. Silas Vane, sitting perfectly still on the cold floor. He was unresponsive, his eyes wide and vacant. He was breathing slow, shallow breaths, sustained by an unknown energy. They carried him out, noting the strange, powerful scent of lilies and burnt sugar emanating from his skin. A scent that grew stronger whenever the wind blew in from the sea, carrying the scent of the life he could no longer live. He was the new, living exhibit of the Museum of Olfactory Memory, the curator of the last breath, forever holding the scent that defied non-existence.